necessarily good to still be awake at the other side of the world. So just to let everybody know, we are recording these sessions and we're also streaming live to YouTube. So if you are logged into Zoom, congratulations. You guys get to ask us questions directly into the Q&A and into the chat function. This time last year, we did quite a lengthy how to use Zoom from a webinar perspective, but I think that maybe 12 months of lockdown practice means we don't necessarily need to do all of that Zoom etiquette anymore, at least I hope not. So please do feel free to constantly engage with us in both chat and also in the Q&A. Yesterday, we managed to answer a wide array of questions and our fantastic speakers who I'll be introducing to you to as we go through the course of this morning. So to the speakers, please do feel free to engage with the Q&A and with the chat. So if you've got additional information to share with all of the fantastic attendees, please do feel free to go for that. If you are watching us via YouTube, we are also keeping an eye on YouTube. And so if you've got questions, comments, ideas, please do feel free to share them in the comments section within YouTube. You'll see that all of the videos from yesterday have already been edited and are on the YouTube channel. So if for some inexplicable reason you don't want to listen to what one of our speakers is saying this morning, you can create your own conference by listening to one of the talks from yesterday afternoon. Don't worry, Ruth, Victor and Hugo, etc. I'm sure that won't be happening because I'm sure your talks are going to be fantastic and absolutely scintillating. So with regards to that, other just bits of housekeeping, we will be leaving the chat, etc., as open as possible, because this week is all about learning from one another. It's about open dialogue and it's about listening to one another's perspectives so that together we can try and ensure that we make the sourcing, the mining, the processing, the selling, etc. of raw materials as responsible as possible. And we can only do that, of course, if we all work together. So we're leaving all of the different channels as open as possible. The only reason why we will shut some of that down is if someone starts to be a bit naughty. So you've all been warned. Don't be naughty, because that will just mean that we have to start shutting down some of the chat functions, etc., which of course hampers things for everybody in terms of being able to learn from one another. Just by way of introduction, so you'll see on the screen in front of you at the moment a variety of wonderful faces. Yes, Victor, you're looking beautiful today, sir. I'm loving the haircut. So you have some of our fabulous speakers who you'll be hearing from over the next few hours, but more about them later. Each of our fabulous speakers will be speaking for approximately 10 minutes, and then the remaining 10 minutes in their time slot will be used for questions. They are all acutely aware that if they go over time on their talks, then their question time just condenses. So speakers, yes, you've worked it out. If you don't want to answer any questions, just keep talking. Or if you don't really have much to say and you want to do it all in questions or interview form, keep your talk nice and short, because the maximum time per speaker is 20 minutes. And what that means is it means we can stick to schedule. And so people who are tuning in on YouTube can therefore keep an eye on the schedule and so therefore know exactly which speaker to expect when. So our fabulous speakers, we will be introducing them later. Other people to introduce to yourselves include the fantastic Rose Clark. Rose, give us a wave. There we go. So Rose is dialing in from Leicester, and Rose is the fabulous person that is, to be honest, behind the majority of the organisation of this week's conference. Every year, this conference seems to get bigger and bigger, and we're well up to, well, way over 500 people have signed up to the conference so far this week, with more and more people, I think, signing up right this second, judging by Rose's face right now. So that is glorious, and everybody is, of course, welcome to join us in on this discussion. We've also got Ellen Casey sitting behind the scenes. Ellen, give us a wave. So Ellen is also supporting us. We've got the fantastic Ludovine, who is hiding behind her company logo there. Hey, Ludovine. Ludovine gave us a fabulous talk yesterday. You may recognize her as being Mrs. Governance. Is that okay, Ludovine, to call you Mrs. Governance? That's fine. Excellent. Ludovine is writing up today's proceedings, as it were. That sounds very formal, in the form of a blog. So it means that hopefully at some point in time in the near future, if you want to read a summary of Ludovine's perspectives as to what our speakers are about to say or have said, because you're going to be writing it after the fact, of course, Ludovine will be writing that up. And just also to introduce her, to double introduce her, the lovely Ruth Allington. Ruth, give us a wave. There we go. So Ruth was filling that blog position yesterday. So watch this space for Ruth's blog as she summarises everything we heard going through yesterday's session in the afternoon. She has assured me that that will be written after she finishes her talk today, because we're greatly looking forward to what Ruth has to say in her talk. Finally, my name is Sarah Gordon, and so together with Rose, we're the co-founders of Responsible Raw Materials. You'll be hearing rather a lot of me today, so my apologies for that. But I'll be attempting to MC and to navigate us through this wonderful array of speakers that we have before us. Now, in terms of this week's conference, if you missed yesterday's introduction, you may be unaware as to all of the wonderful materials that we have online on the website. Or even if you did see yesterday's, things have been updated slightly overnight because we've already managed to embed people's talks within their abstracts and from yesterday's sessions. But just in case you did miss yesterday's, if you go to the website at www.responsiblerawmaterials.com, you'll come across this as being the homepage. And you can either click on Learn More to go to the conference that is being run this week, or you can click on this tab at the top of the page. So if you click on there, that will then take you to where you can sign up. It will also take you to the link straight to YouTube if you'd prefer to watch everything through YouTube rather than through Zoom. We also have the fabulous infographic that is being put together at the moment. This is something that will gently evolve as we go through the week. And what you can see here is that in the dark bubbles, these are a range of the different stakeholders that we might see coming to the table when all of us are clubbing together to try and ensure that our raw materials are sourced, etc., in the most responsible way possible. And then in the white little speech bubbles, these are all different ideas of tools, techniques, tips, tricks, and approaches that can be used to actually make ESG, or environment, social, and governance, a reality within this space. So the purpose of this year's conference is building on everything that we've been hearing over the last few years, really, where we all understand that ESG, or sustainability, is absolutely critical within raw materials, as of course it is within everything. So we all understand that's important, but how do we actually get it to work? How do we make ESG a reality within raw materials? And it's our suggestion, or the hypothesis, is that we probably need to use rather a lot of different tools, tips, and tricks and techniques to be able to make it a reality. And so the purpose of this week's conference is try to hear from as many different people as possible as to what those tools could be, how you might use them, and how they can make ESG a reality within raw materials, some of which we've attempted to capture within this little infographic that we have up here. If any of you are interested in using this infographic at a later date, please let us know, and that is totally okay for you to do that. You'll be able to download it direct from the website and use it in any materials you should so desire. Now, in terms of the conference itself, you can see that we have our wonderful schedule here, which again, you can click on and expand and explore in a bit more detail. Sitting behind each one of these lovely boxes, we have a whole array of abstracts. Now, to find the abstracts, you just need to click on this button here. So all abstracts can be found here, and that takes you to a separate page, which does make you feel slightly ill during that transition. And what you can see here is everybody's name, all of our speakers' names, plus the title of the talk that they will be giving. So, okay, if I just zoom in slightly on this, we're now on Tuesday, the 11th of May, and we're going to start off in approximately 10 minutes time with the fabulous Hugues Brody from the London Metal Exchange, who's going to be talking about sustainability within base metals. So you can see this morning's array of fabulous speakers. Then, of course, we have a really nice long lunch break. I would say that this is so that we can have a long break for lunch. In reality, what it means is that we can allow people within the Americas to perhaps wake up and be able to join us. And so that's why we're starting the morning sessions really quite early in terms of UK time, and the afternoon sessions a little bit late, is to try and make the conference as accessible as possible to people who live in different parts of the world, because of course we welcome all perspectives and all cultures to be able to come and join us on this dialogue. So here you can see all of the different talks that we've got lined up for the rest of the week. God, Rose, it almost makes me feel tired looking at all of that. We've barely scratched the surface in terms of starting this. It's really exciting. So last year we had 75 speakers that joined us through 65 talks. And this year we've got at least 81 speakers, with a couple more being added and just slotted in around the edges. So it's a jam-packed full schedule that we have for you, but really, really exciting. So in terms of those abstracts, you can find everybody's abstracts just sitting down below. So you just click on these buttons and they will open up into everybody's abstracts. If you're finding it difficult to find an abstract, another way of getting to it is to click on the talks page. Okay, so you can either go through that here, or you can explore all of our buttons up the top. Okay, so you can move all of this around. So you can click on talks. That then takes you to the Responsible Raw Materials overarching talks page. And within here, we have all the talks from last year, other bits and pieces we've been up to over the last 12 months as well. And what you can do within this, which is great, is you can hit the search button and I can type in Ludovine, okay, because Ludovine gave a fantastic talk yesterday. And what we have here is you can see that Ludovine's actually given us 2 talks. She gave us a talk last year and she gave us a talk yesterday as well. And what we can do is we can click on that talk. And what you can see is we've already managed to embed Ludovine's little 20-minute video from what she told us yesterday within her abstract. And then we also have a bit of a biography for Ludovine as well. So if you want to know more about any of our speakers, please do feel free to go and take a look at the abstracts, because most of them will have a biography within them. They are all more than happy for you to reach out and engage with them in discussion. And also as well, with regards to that, if you can't find them through our platform, they are probably on the likes of LinkedIn, or do feel free to reach out to us and we will attempt to facilitate an introduction if you would like to speak to anybody and get some more information from them as well. So just stopping sharing that screen, if people have questions with regards to the website or where to find any of the materials, please do reach out over chat or over the comments, etc. within YouTube. And we are always open to trying to improve things. We're a small volunteer team that run Responsible Raw Materials. Responsible Raw Materials is not affiliated to any grants or any big organizations or anything like that. And so we are always very, very keen to get your feedback and ideas as to how we can improve on how we share all of this fantastic information that we are beginning to collate together. So before I get cracking with a little bit of a summary as to what we heard yesterday, 2 final things for you all to be aware of. Firstly, if you think that this week is shaping up to be really, really interesting and you want to know more, we are really grateful in that we have received quite a lot of fantastic sponsorship, which has allowed us to actually pay for a number of training courses to be run next week and the week after. You'll see on the website, I won't share it again because I'm sure you're all capable of going to the website. You'll see that there are 3 training courses that we are able to offer for free. If you are interested on coming on one of those training courses, then please either reach out to us at hello@responsiblerawmaterials.com or email Ellen. Ellen, give us a wave again. Or email Ellen direct at ellen@satala.com, and she should hopefully be able to slot you in. We do limit the capacity of each training course to 15 people. So we keep it nice and small, which means there can be lots of fantastic discussion and sharing of ideas. Each training course is 6 hours in total, broken into sets of 3 hours across 2 days. i.e. on day 1, you do 3 hours, and then on day 2, you do 3 hours. So it shouldn't be really nasty in terms of too much time in front of your computer. But if you're interested in that, please do let us know. We are looking to keep these open to as diverse a group of people as possible. And we do have allocated spaces for the likes of people at the beginning of their careers, etc., and from different parts of the world who might otherwise not be able to gain access to these sorts of courses. So thank you very, very much to our fantastic sponsors. Of course, as always, if anybody is interested in sponsoring one of these courses or the conference as a whole, please do let Rose and myself know. The Zoom license, of course, as we get more and more people logging on, the Zoom license does go up in cost. So any contributions that you can give would be most appreciated. Rose, is there anything else I need to say just in terms of that introduction before I give a quick recap from yesterday? She's shaking her head, which means I must have managed to get through the list of bits and pieces, which is always good. So just before we pass to the fantastic Hugo Brody from the London Metals Exchange, what did we get up to yesterday? So yesterday afternoon, we took a look at what do we mean by the E, or the environment, the S, or the social, and the G, and the governance. And we had those introductions from Tobias Kindrieper from WWF. So he talked about some of the different aspects from an environmental stance. But of course, you can never look at these things in isolation. He did, of course, overlap into the social space, which was really encapsulated fantastically by Susan Joyce, who not only is an expert when it comes to social as a whole, but also has deep, deep expertise with regards to things like human rights. We then passed to the fabulous Ludovine, who's already featured heavily this morning. And Ludovine, as Mrs. Governance, gave us an insight as to that world of governance and what does it really mean, and tackled head on the fact that sometimes people shy away from including governance within ESG because they perceive it to be really difficult. But of course, she told it was really easy and all of us can do it. I know that that is paraphrasing what Ludovine says. You still, of course, need the experts in there to help you, but it should certainly be something that helps us all to maintain that accountability and create that culture within the organizations that we work within. We then passed across to the fantastic Elaine Dorward-King, who in a previous life headed up all of the sustainability space within Newmont, so one of the world's largest mining companies. And Elaine now sits on countless boards, bringing her vast array of experience and expertise to ensure that those mining companies continue to act in the most responsible way possible and constantly look for the opportunities that are afforded to them through ESG. After Elaine, we then passed across to Emma Beattie, who really took us into a world of, okay, so if we've got the mining space, so we understand what ESG means, we've taken a look at what this means for mining. How about governments? And so how do governments look at this? What does this mean for different mining codes? And how do different governments around the world structure or formalize perhaps the different ways in which we look at things like mining? So Emma gave us a little bit of insight into the world of governments. We then passed to Paul Pritchard. So yes, it did take us a while to get back into the boys again. So we then passed to Paul Pritchard, who gave us an insight into the world of finance and banking, and some of the new mechanisms that have been coming through in recent years on that side. So especially with regards to carbon disclosure and different types of sustainability finance, which are really beginning to pick up steam at the moment. After Paul, we then passed across to James Fryer, who gave us insight into the world of insurance. James's very frank and open talk was brilliant, because I think what he showed us was that there's a massive array of opportunity in the world of insurance to really come to the table and to help mining and, of course, the rest of our supply chains to make sure that we act in the most responsible way possible. So Paul brought us banking. James brought us insurance, and just to lighten the mood towards the end of the day, we had the fantastic Professor Ian Stewart, who really brought to us, okay, how do we communicate and engage in dialogue with multiple different stakeholders? So Ian, you might recognize him as being the geology man from the TV. At least those of us in the UK will certainly recognize him from various BBC shows, etc. And Ian's shared with us some of that insight as to how do you engage with different people from across different sectors, etc. Finally, we were joined by Kat Bell, who is the founder of the Young Mining Professionals and also works for Rio Tinto, who helped us with the final panel discussion that wrapped up yesterday's session. So if you want more insight as to what is meant by ESG and different perspectives, be it from mining, be it from governments, finance, etc., then please do feel free to check out those videos from yesterday, because that gave us a fantastic tee up to today's session. And so Hugo, I saw him testing his mic just now. Hugo, if you want to come off mute and begin to share your slides. Hugo Brody joins us from the London Metal Exchange. He did give us a talk last year. So if you really like what Hugo has to say, then you'll be able to find his talk from last year on the talks on the website, as I just showed you. But Hugo, I'm going to pass straight across to you to get you to introduce yourself and welcome today to today's conference. Thank you very much, Hugo.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And so that was me about to go off mute. Then I felt my hay fever coming on, so I quickly went back on mute. So it was let's pretend it was a test. Yeah. So thank you guys. So I guess first of all, thank you guys again for inviting me back to this responsible sourcing, responsible raw materials summit. It's really good to see all the different sessions that have occurred, and I think all super relevant to what I'm about to go into as well. So hopefully I think you guys will agree that we fit in quite well within the schedule. Yeah, as Sarah said, my name is Hugo Brody, and just to kick off with a little bit of personal history about me, I'll just set my timer on so I don't go over too far. I think I'm right in saying I'm the first VP for sustainability the LME has ever had in its 144-year history, unless there was some sort of short-lived sustainability team back in the roaring 1920s that didn't make it to the LME's history books. But I suppose this is sort of unsurprising, considering the LME sustainability team was officially formed in the middle of last year, towards the end of last year. So this is not to say that this was the first time the LME ever focused on ethical or sustainable projects. And I'm hoping there's a few producers of base metal brands out there, or those who are involved in the LME value chains, tuned into this webinar on YouTube, who already have some idea of the responsible sourcing work we've been working on in the last few years. So this work so far has particularly centered on, and for those who saw my presentation last year, you'll know this, on the ethical sourcing of minerals when it comes to human rights, as in preventing child labor and conflict minerals mitigation, which I'll cover very briefly in my 10 minutes in a little bit. However, since I spoke at this webinar last year, our sustainability strategy has moved on in order to, amongst other things, and amongst other sustainability aspects, help facilitate the huge decarbonisation task that we all collectively have and share. So this is probably a good point before we dive into what sustainability means for the LME and base metals, to give a little bit of insight into what the LME is and who we are. As I know, hopefully most people will know, but you never know. So I'm going to give my attempt to share my screen. There we go. Seems to be working. Yeah, so who are we? Well, in a nutshell, we are a forwards exchange of the world's largest market in options and futures or fuel forwards contracts for base metals. And the services we actually perform and are, well, the first one's pricing, so the price generated by those in our trading floors, our trading platforms at the moment are used in procurement contracts globally. The second is hedging, and users can protect against volatile markets and adverse price movements. And we've seen some particularly strong markets this year in terms of pricing. So users can use the LME for that via our members. And finally, and the reason we're a little bit unique and why responsible sourcing and sustainability and ESG is very important to us is when a futures contract comes to expiry on our market, it's possible to actually take delivery of metal from one of our licensed warehouses around the world. So there's a physical delivery component. So often as a last resort, metal that meets LME requirements, which up until now have been only chemical and metallurgical and shape requirements, but will now be, as of this year, and the reporting year has already started, ethical requirements too, can also be delivered onto the exchange. And this is vital for our users in order to discover prices that are relevant to them. So sustainability. So what has the LME been doing recently and trying to do in promoting responsible raw material work? And given that we as an organization all never really directly purchase or sell metal, what can we do? So those of you who tuned in last year remember, so in 2017, we began our responsible sourcing journey, mainly focused on human rights as a direct response to growing concerns from us and our stakeholders that our listed brands should only be sourced meeting internationally accepted standards for human rights. So since then, in our view, the responsibility debate, which in 2017 we felt was most primarily focused on conflict minerals, has moved on to incorporate a much broader spectrum of sustainability issues. And we're conscious that in respect of environmental considerations, in particular, there is a clear call now that companies in our value chain and markets, ourselves very much included, should now be doing more and be doing better. So just as an anecdotal personal example, when I first started attending these sustainability-focused metals conferences only a few years ago, the attendees used to be one or two OEMs, a few hipster-type specialist sustainability-focused hedge funds, and now it's very positive to see that the vast majority of stakeholders in the base metals world, at least, are starting to take notice, and many actually are seen as leading the charge at many of these events. So at the LME, we believe that the metals industry can and should be the cornerstone of the sustainability and the energy transition. And this slide here hopefully gives a bit more information as to the broad categories that we see we can and already are directly contributing to as a base metals industry and across the value chain. So the first, of course, is responsible sourcing, which I can cover a bit more in a second. Then there was also low carbon production. Green technology is our third category we see. So things such as supporting industry actors who are pioneering sustainable technology like electric vehicles. And then finally, the circular economy, so the aim of eliminating waste and the continual recycling of resources. So as this next slide suggests, we're proud that the LME, we're already contributing to what we see as a more ethical future. So as this slide lays out, we believe we can contribute across our base metals with our current service offerings. So a quick example is within the circular economy, for example, our aluminium alloy contracts already service the scrap and recycling industries, and they do this by allowing metal recyclers to plan and have fair pricing for their raw materials. We also have a number of contracts that help with EV battery development, so our cobalt, nickel, and lithium contracts. So it's really now our core aim that LME deliverable metal is seen as sustainably sourced, and that our services that we provide are kind of helping our industry contribute to a more sustainable future. So what are we doing in terms of responsible sourcing and human rights, which I know I touched on very briefly last year, but I'll spend a minute or two on it. So after much market engagement and using the OECD guidance as our foundation, we're introducing responsible sourcing requirements. So requirements focus on human rights, mitigating against child labor for all of our LMEs, the LME's 450 plus deliverable brands across the world, so for all of our physically delivered contracts. So now it's a rule that if you want to list metal on the LME, you have to do the appropriate due diligence when it comes to ethical, responsible sourcing in terms of human rights. I think there's slides. So how will, I'm jumping all over the place. So how will this work in practice? So in particular, as I said, our approaches are grounded in the OECD guidance. The 5 steps are built into our strategy. We have 3 tracks. You can use an OECD aligned route to comply, or you can use the LME's red flag assessment template to comply. But crucially, whichever track a brand selects, they'll be able to complete the OECD 5 steps. You can find out more about exactly how this will work in, maybe you can tune into last year's webinar. I think it's available on YouTube, or we have webinars on the LME website which show exactly how this will work in practice. So what else are we doing in the near term to support other categories outside of human rights of sustainability, including transparency of low carbon production in the aluminium industry and other industries? Well, our plan in the next few months is to launch LME Passport, which is our new platform that will enable the attaching of voluntary sustainability metrics to brands. So what is LME Passport all about? Well, essentially, initially, it's a digital credentials register. And interestingly, its first goal is to deliver safeguarded, accessible electronic certificate of analysis information for every lot of metal delivered into and following withdrawal from the LME warehouse network. And again, the first goal was initially aimed at reducing the operational burden of using the LME by removing the need for paper certificates of analysis. But we realized we can also add a second goal when designing this platform. And the second goal of LME Passport, beyond the core mission of electronifying COAs, is to enable the system to support additional information for both LME brands and non-LME listed brands, information provided on a voluntary basis. So for example, low carbon production information can be appended onto this transparency platform. So interested producers could input, for example, the environmental criteria of their metals brands, or maybe a certification by an industry scheme. So for instance, in aluminium, it could be the ASI, Aluminium Stewardship Initiative certification. They could show consumers that they have met these goals or the thresholds for ASI. But essentially, the system will allow all market users to view the information to increase and promote the transparency of sustainability metrics globally. And we're initially prescribing that only LME members and listed warehouses, companies, or producers will be able to undertake the uploading of data, just so we know we have a relationship with those who are going to be enabled to upload this type of information. So just in the interest of time, I'll quickly show this last slide. So the idea here is to give an idea of a type of data we expect that's going to be voluntarily uploaded to Passport. So here's a slide showing our yet to be finalized proposed LME Passport value add themes. So our near-term primary question that we're discussing with our stakeholders involved in the base metals industry, our producers in particular, is how best can we develop this platform so that it sorts and demonstrates sustainability information clearly, particularly low carbon production information in the aluminium value chain. And we know this is an area where a great many stakeholders have invested a great deal of time and money, and this will give some oversight as to our initial thinking. The caveat being that this taxonomy is by no means set in stone, and we're still keen to hear from interested parties to see if we've got our categorization right. So in wrapping up, given my slightly going over, so I suppose we're by no means saying that we are have I stopped sharing? Hopefully I have. So we're by no means saying that we see ourselves as the world experts on all areas of sustainability within all of the LME's metal value chains. And one of the most important aspects of my role at the moment is listening to those who are the experts, such as those coming up next after me and in the previous day of these sessions, who are experts and understanding how this subject is evolving. So Please do get in touch if you think there's an area of focus that we at the LME should be getting more involved in, or support, or areas where we can support the great work that we're hearing about for the rest of today as well. So one thing that's clear to me as the longer I've been focusing on this area is that no matter how much we want, the problems and answers aren't black and white. They're more often many nuances that you only get to grips with when you're putting theory into practice. And so as an exchange, we're obviously centered at the very center of global markets. So we have a fantastic opportunity and responsibility to act as catalysts for the sustainable development of these markets that we run. So yeah, I'll probably leave it there and open up to 1 minute of Q&A. Sorry about that.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Hugo. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in putting your hands together from behind your muted microphones and to say a massive thank you to Hugo. And don't worry, mate, you've got a whole 5 minutes of questions. So no, yeah, that was fantastic.
Preemptively started my clock and it was worrying me, but
no, so ladies and gents, if you've got questions for Hugo, please do feel free to put them into chat or into the Q&A, or if you're on YouTube, please do put them into the chat there as well. Just while they're coming in, so firstly, Hugo, congratulations on being the first VP of Sustainability for the LME. That's absolutely brilliant, and it's really interesting, I think, to hear the positioning that the LME is taking with regards to that. That's absolutely fantastic. Just in terms of the passport, etc., and I guess this new criteria that you're asking people to be able to prove that they can adhere to. Now, obviously, you're aligning to OECD, which is great, and we do actually have a talk from the OECD later on this week, which will be fantastic. But in terms of verifying that what somebody is telling you is true, how is the LME going about verifying I guess the truth and the honesty in terms of the data and the intelligence that's being uploaded into that platform?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there's two distinctions really. So for human rights and our OECD guidance-based rules, so there are actually going to be requirements that brands of the LME have to meet in order to be an LME brand. So, and we felt there was a clear global definition already available, which the OECD had spent years working on when it comes to child labor and the mitigation of conflict minerals. And that is actually going to be due diligence by our brands having to comply with a standard that's been OECD aligned and the standard's own auditing requirements from on the ground independent third-party auditors who will need to approve them. When it comes to sustainable production, let's say in climate change and carbon production, we don't yet see there's a globally accepted across all base metals definition that stands out and is accepted by those in India, those in Norway, and that where they all agree on what constitutes low carbon production throughout their value chains. So at the moment, it's going to be voluntary uploading of sustainability metrics that we expect from those type of producers. But there is a lot of work out there, and we expect what's going to be voluntarily uploaded are things such as the ASI aluminium certification, which has got cradle to gate analysis of sustainable production within the aluminium value chain. And we're going to see what's going to be most uploaded, what's most useful to people. And from there, we can also see what our consumers will also be searching for when they're looking for low carbon produced aluminium. So that's the distinction between, I guess, human rights, where we see it as a universally accepted definition, and then low carbon production across all value chains, which is still not quite there yet, but we think it's coming. So
is that something where I guess it'll be a sort of an iterative approach? So as you can see where the best practice begins to emerge, that's the avenue that you'll then begin to support. Would that be a correct summary?
I think that's fair. And we also are in ongoing conversations with both the ASI and the International Aluminium Institute, who again have done about 2 decades worth of work trying to understand exactly where emissions take place from your bauxite mine to your smelter. There's also various innovations where we've heard about where there's neutral carbon anodes that produce less carbon in the smelter. So it's all these different types of technologies, and we're trying to just understand how best they will be equated or worked out. So yeah, so I think that's fair. It's an iterative approach.
Fantastic. No, that's brilliant. Thank you for that, Hugo. So one final question before we pass to our next speaker, and this comes from Shivani in the chat. And Shivani says, is there an analysis of the level of green premium on commodities that have passed the LME responsibility sourced requirements? Do you have any comments on that?
So there are various different news agencies, CRU, Fast Markets, Platts, who all now are publishing a low carbon aluminium price. I don't think it's any of them have published it being anything above zero yet, but I think the general consensus is that there will be a premium for low carbon produced aluminium. But again, it's going to very much depend on the definition that different producers are using, because what you don't want is greenwashing and a producer just selects the definition that suits their value chain best, and then the definition that completely excludes the entire market. So there's not any impetus for them to go further and meet these targets. So it's a difficult one. But as the LME, I can't comment on pricing directly. So I could just say there are these new news services out there that are looking to produce these prices.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Hugo. And I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, if you've got other questions for Hugo, do feel free to post them into chat or into the Q&A, and he'll be happy to answer them. So, ladies and gents, put your hands together for the fabulous Hugo Brody. Thank you very much, Hugo. Brilliant.
Thank you for having me. Cheers. Thank you.
Awesome. And so now whistling on to our next speaker who we have for you this morning. So Master Victor, sir, I can see he has turned on his camera, he's turned off that mute button, etc. And now he is sharing his slides. So we've got Victor Carrera from Intro, who has given us the fairly emotive title, I think, Victor, that's all that can be said here, of Diplomacy versus Military Force. Who will win? So Victor, round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for Victor, and over to yourself. Thank you very much, Victor.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you again for organizing this conference on the ESG, which I believe is very useful to everyone working on the mineral raw materials value chain. My background is on geology. I also work on management for a couple of years, and I'm serving as Secretary General of the International Raw Materials Observatory. And the observatory itself, it positions as an honest broker, meaning that we try to collect information on many different aspects that can come from the, let's say, from the economic side, or from the political side, or from the cultural or any other social constraint, and any factor that might in fact have an impact on mineral raw materials. And I'm trying to bring this perspective to this conference, because it's not only about ESGs, but it's about how the, let's say, the environmental context can impact the work that you are doing. The outline of the presentation has 3 points, and I'll jump directly to trade and power, because as we all know, trade was linked to, and resources trade in particular, has been always linked to the industry needs. And whenever this trade was blocked, at least until recently in the past, what nations used to do was to resort to warfare. And a great example was the beginning of the well, it was the invasion of Manchuria by Japan, and that was the seed for the beginning of the Second World War. But also coming from the Second World War, we had the creation of the European Community for Steel and Coal, and that was a change, because in a way it brought to the table this soft power approach, because soft power, unlike hard power that is based on coercion, soft power brings up this idea of co-opt and attract. And this is different. Of course, we can argue that we had that before with the League of Nations, and in a way also with the United Nations. But this was if you want, the foundation of the European Union, and that has provided several decades of peace in Europe. If you look now to raw materials the industry and market size, and if you organize the countries according to this classification of having, let's say, a great geological endowment and the size of the market, then you begin to understand how development strategies have developed. So raw materials, when raw materials are abundant, and if there is a small market, what you find is normally raw materials producing countries. And the examples in the graphic of Australia, Canada, and Chile illustrate this very well. On the other side, if you don't have raw materials, and if you have a big market, or if you used to have raw materials, like it's the case of Europe, but for the time being you are not extracting them, then you have these market-driven economies, the examples, Japan and Europe. And the worst case scenario, you don't have raw materials and you are a small country, either you go to some sort of specialization in services like it happened with Switzerland, or you are facing difficulties because you don't have this source of wealth. And again, the best case scenario, you have raw materials and you have a big nation. It used to be only the United States. Now China is also coming to this new scenario. Then if you look to the way countries used to relate themselves in this context, you see what normally happens is that these raw materials producing countries, they tend to have some sort of market couple, and this coupling with these different, if you want, with the selected partners, you can see it very clearly in Australia and in Canada. Australia, they used to partner with Japan, but then with the rise of China, these days, roughly 80% of the exports of Australia go to China. And in the case of Canada, the main destination for their exports is the United States. I'm talking, of course, about raw materials exports, minerals, raw materials. But if you don't have these mineral raw materials, as the case of Europe, of Japan, then you need to resort to other strategies. The case of Japan is a good one because there is this top-down approach coming from the state of trying to figure out how can we find minerals, of securing minerals. And JOCMEC, the Japanese association, is organization doing that. It's a government organization, is very active on that because they put together all the different parts of the equation, and they try to help their domestic companies in a very proactive way. At the same time, the Japanese are also among the best in the world in recycling. Of course, they can only recycle what exists in their internal market. And because they are an exporting nation, they also need mineral raw materials, primary mineral raw materials. So recycling is not enough for their needs. In the case of Europe, Europe is basically using trade, if you want, as their big lever. So trade, and if you look to the raw materials policy, you see that trade is coming with the ensure level playing field and access to resources, and then in small, the same size circles with I would say with a minor importance, this idea of having domestic sourcing and also resource efficiency and recycling. At the same time, and this is important, the European Union is putting a lot of money on research and innovation. And this is made directly by Horizon 2020, also by the AIT Raw Materials, which is bringing together the triangle of academia, industry, and research. So imagine that you have, you are one of these countries, again in Europe, but you need mineral raw materials. Basically, you have two options. Either you resort to trade or you start investing on domestic supply. And these are the typical problems that you face. Trade brings together this idea of international competition, which is a rising problem because in the past, let's say before 2001, before China entered the World Trade Organization, the supply demand was more or less balanced. So in fact, the demand was bigger than the demand was smaller than the supply, and now it changed. So nowadays what's happening is that there's more demand than supply, and that is boosting prices of some mineral raw materials. And this is what we are expecting in the future. But you also have problems with the resources nationalism. When countries decide to put some sort of barriers to trade or to create export taxes because they want to increase the added value of the ores they are exporting. And in some cases, you also have dumping. On the domestic supply side, at least in Europe, these are the major problems that we have. I mean, the deposits that we have been exploited in the past. So what we have now are low grades and smaller deposits. The extraction costs tend to be higher. And of course, there is a strong problem with what we call the social license to operate, basically a lot of public opposition. And the solutions to that, the ones that are normally being developed, in the case of trade, are of course economic diplomacy, all this cooperation on different areas, and also the development of, if you want, tariff and non-tariff barriers, sort of penalties. And this is where I will place standards and ESG. So in a way, what we are telling countries is that if you are not performing well enough, you'll be facing some sort of barrier, as it was just mentioned about aluminium. So this comes into a way of, let's say, trying to highlight the best practice and to favor them. On the domestic supply, I was using these three different tools that we are being used to curb these problems. Dialogues, and I included into commerce persuasion after hearing yesterday's communication from Jens Stewart, because I believe it's still what happens in many cases, is that we try to persuade communities that a mine is good for them. And of course, money and a lot of investment on research and development. Going quickly through this, for instance, the European Union is basically using trade as the big leverage. What you see in green are all these free trade agreements. And you see that what Europe aims to have is a lot of options, because the more options you have, the more bargain power you will be having. At the same time, the European Union is investing in research and innovation, and this European Raw Materials Alliance is a good example of that, bringing many different stakeholders. If you look to the United States, the approach is completely different. I mean, the United States, they have this power. If you want, they have this hard power because they have the military capacity, and basically they can create a trade war. And at the same time, because they have a big market, they can use this realpolitik approach. And what they are doing, this is news from a couple of weeks ago, what they are doing now, working together with Canada and Australia, is using that, basically bringing together the partners they used to work with. The Chinese, I believe these are also important players. What the Chinese are doing is completely different. Until now, basically, they were using diplomacy, all this economic diplomacy, and this Silk Road or the Belt and Road approach from China is in a way an illustration of that. They are basically working with neighboring countries, developing infrastructure. Of course, we can argue that there's a price for that, but in fact, the Chinese are doing it, and it's if you want, is a sort of economic diplomacy. But at the same time, the Chinese are also using a solution that they call strategic delay. Basically, what they are doing, and the example here are from the boats in the South China Sea, is that they are trying to claiming that these areas belong to them, and then they are using this strategic delay approach to, let's say, to cover their expansionist aims. And in fact, the reason why apparently they are in the South Sea China is because that was a report from recent, it has 2 or 3 weeks, is that there are mineral raw materials, so some metallic nodules with rare earths in that region. The Chinese also have another advantage. They don't face public opposition, they don't have cost problem, and they haven't depleted their biggest deposit. So in a way, they are better positioned than the others. And whatever is the future, I believe the solution will be outlined in this hard power versus soft power line. And to illustrate that, you see that the United States still have a strong military presence abroad, all over the world, meaning that they can resort to hard power whenever they need. And the Chinese, they used to be on the soft power side, together with the European Union and the Japanese, basically trying to use economic diplomacy to obtain the raw materials they look for, but they are now moving quickly to the hard power side of this line. And this, of course, is, if you want, something that should worry us all. I believe, however, that we have grounds for optimism, and basically for three reasons. The first one is the geological endowment. No nation has all the minerals or all the raw materials that a sophisticated industry needs. So this brings the idea that we always need trade. The second factor is that if you look to this technology driving force, we are using more raw materials than ever before, meaning that, again, trade is the only solution because you cannot have all the raw materials you need. And finally, a problem that we are facing, and this is climate change. It's also a driver of change. Climate change is, in a way, a problem that can only be solved by cooperation. And by bringing this idea of cooperation, I believe this will be in the soft power side of the line. And this is all from my side. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. If you want to have more insights on this, let's say, distant factors that might impact the raw materials value chain, have a look at the World Barometer in the website of Intro. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Victor. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for a big round of applause from the fabulous, for the fabulous Victor Carrera. That was absolutely brilliant. Thanks, Victor. So firstly, of course, please do feel free to go and check out the Intro's World Barometer that's there, and we'll make sure all the links are freely available to everybody. Secondly, Victor, as somebody who is, of course, based in Scotland, actually, so maybe we're closer to Europe than the rest of the UK. I don't know what's going on there at the moment. And of course, this time last year was pre-Brexit. Now we are post-Brexit. So just again, while waiting for the questions to come in, from the United Kingdom's perspective, there's been an awful lot of conversation over the last 12 months about what should the British strategy be in terms of raw materials, because of course until the beginning of last year we were very much part of Europe. Given your overview of different approaches just now, do you have any suggestions as to what the British strategy should be? And be polite, Victor.
Well, my perception is that the British still have a strong military structure. So you see that in these recent confrontations in the South Sea, China, one of the countries that deployed war vessels there was the UK. So you still have that capacity, but I'm not seeing the UK go into any sort of conflict with China because that doesn't make sense. At the same time, the UK normally use this economic diplomacy in a very active way. I do remember that the UK was very active doing diplomacy with Russia, for instance. Nowadays, if you want, this diplomatic situation is not so it's not so good as it used to be. But I do believe that UK, with time, will be using more soft power. And realizing that the hard power solution is not good enough, because you cannot solve these big problems that we are all facing collectively in isolation.
I'm very glad that you haven't just said that we should go to war with China, Victor. I'm very relieved by that at this precise second in time. There's a great question that's actually come in from Ludovine here in the chat, and she asks, do you see the strong connection between the Critical Raw Materials Initiative and the EU Green Deal as a sign of this policy shift, i.e. will others follow the EU's lead, for example, the US?
I believe a lot will depend on timing. The US are already having that approach. I mean, the Democrats are pushing these infrastructure investments, and together with that, there is a strong there is a lot of money for the energy transition. But the point is that at least my perception is that it depends on timing, because the country that is best positioned right now to be the first one to be climate neutral is clearly China, because they have the market, they have the technology, they have the raw materials. And if if you want, in that competition for who will going to be the first, I believe the Chinese will be perfectly positioned, and they also have this big advantage of not having internal opposition. I mean, it's a different political system. So what we are trying to do in Europe is to show to communities that raw materials are needed for the energy transition, but at the same time, the message that policymakers are passing is that we are not going against people. So this creates like a difficult to solve dilemma. And of course, I believe that we are still relying on trade, assuming that we'll be sourcing the raw materials we need from South America or from Europe, but this isn't going to be so easy. So it depends a lot on the timing. Assuming that we'll have time enough, I believe we can position ourselves and be leaders in that. If not, I believe we'll be followers.
Brilliant. So with that, thank you very, very much, Victor. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for another round of applause for the brilliant Victor. Thank you very much, mate. Brilliant. So going from hard power, soft power into the world of listening and persuasion. So we heard Victor already cite some of the talks from yesterday. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce you, ladies and gentlemen, to the wonderful Ruth Allington, who is going to talk to us about the effective dialogue and the persuasive power of listening. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together, and Ruth, over to yourself. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Sarah. Could I just double check that you're seeing my opening slide?
We are. Your timing was perfect.
Fantastic. So I'd just like to start with a short introduction to myself. My education and training is in engineering geology originally, but over a almost 40-year career, I've become a specialist in resource evaluation, primarily for construction materials and the design of quarries to recover them responsibly. For construction materials, geology is obviously fundamental, but timescales are much, much shorter than in, for example, metal mining, both for developing a project and for the life of the quarry itself. It's the topic of another talk, but essentially I've spent 40 years or so working with ESG through optimization of all of the non-geological constraints and considerations, the modifying factors in minerals reporting language. The concept of temporary use of land is very much alive in this world, and the geological part is usually actually the easiest and the shortest part. But I say again, obviously not unimportant, fundamental. But along the way in this career, I've acquired experience initially by accident and much later on by design. Experience and professional qualifications in dispute resolution and facilitation. Initially, I acted, I had the opportunity to act as an expert witness, and later I became involved in alternative dispute resolution as a mediator. And it's on that area of my professional practice that I want to focus today, highlighting the value that the skills and experience that I value can add to ESG performance. So we're going from the very big pictures that we've heard so far in the conference to the essence of some professional skills and tools that we can use. So I want to start by examining the issues that arise from a hint at the bottom of this really excellent Satala summary of how to map your stakeholders as part of enterprise risk management training that they offer. Very many thanks to Satala for permission to share this with you. And as an aside, I can personally recommend Satala training, some of which will be offered next week. This is a really great hint. It's simple and to the point, but I want to concentrate today on how we figure out what these perspectives are. Oh, sorry, the clicking's gone amiss. There we go. As you see on my slide, there are some key influences that make this quite difficult. Making assumptions and acting on our preconceived ideas will inevitably be wrong, in my experience. Somehow we need to find out the best way to establish what these perspectives are. And the best way we could do that could be to ask them. But this turns out to be extraordinarily difficult for us to do. So I want to look a bit more at the framework on this excellent fact sheet for mapping and creating our communication and consultation strategies with each group of stakeholders, and introduce the concept of trust. As you see, where there's a high degree of trust, acceptance, stakeholders tend to fall in the bottom left, so low interest, lower influence. These are likely to be more supportive of our project and less engaged. But things happen that suddenly change this. For example, a community that gives its informed consent to a project that it rather likes, that gives it economic stability, lots of community, lots of jobs and so on, will very quickly withdraw that consent when faced with a reality that's different from what they thought they had been promised. Sometimes what they actually had been promised, but I use those words advisedly, what they thought they had been promised. A low level of trust or acceptance in a proposal or project leads to a likelihood of more hostility and more engagement. And we see that in daily life, in the vaccine debates, in political debates, and so on. Stakeholders cannot be pigeonholed for all time. I was really struck yesterday to hear Ludivine Wouters identify her top pick as a key element of the ESG toolbox for making ESG a reality. She identified the creation of a culture where stakeholders no longer believe that they belong only to one category. So you might think from that, that because we are all in fact stakeholders in more than one category at any one time, that it would make it easier for us to all understand the perspectives of other stakeholders like us. But my experience tells me that's just simply not true. We find it difficult to unravel where we individually sit as stakeholders, and even more impossible to unravel what motivates and drives the attitudes and perceptions of other stakeholders. I think this may be because we operate within systems and cultures that label us and put us in silos. Families, tribes, interest groups, power bases, call them what you will. And those systems have us represent those systems and cultures at different times. Many of you may recognize what is happening in my cartoon here. This is a snapshot of a really familiar scenario, at least it's really familiar to me. Here are two people or groups of people represented by two people locked in debate mode over, for example, a permit application for a new open pit mine. They are both human beings, both presumably citizens, consumers, perhaps employees, members of families and other communities, but here they are representing two stakeholder groups. Each party brings forward their best arguments, they do their research, evidence is pitted against emotion, they recruit others to side with them. Lawyers and consultants make a lot of money making their cases for them. They create and exploit power imbalances. Everything escalates. It's too difficult for anyone to concede. There's no possibility for common ground. They simply don't speak the same language. They get nowhere, and so they try to convince independent decision makers. In this example, typically a planning inspector or a judge or an arbitrator. They try to use force of their argument to persuade the decision maker. They push it off to somebody else to decide. The decision maker decides between the 2 points of view. Someone wins and the other loses. You're not listening. I've already told you that. You are being unreasonable are the sorts of phrases we use to each other and to the other side. But what is really going on? What's stopping these people hearing what the other has to say? What is going on is that the actual fundamental views, the feelings and needs of the parties are unspoken and unacknowledged. Neither is understood and both feel powerless. This is a version of what Marshall Rosenberg calls violence in communication. Now that sounds like a very, very strong word to use, but please note that violence in this context, when it was used by Marshall Rosenberg in communication, is described as not necessarily aggressive or intentionally confrontational or damaging. Persuading someone to do something for their own good, or because it's the least worst option, or in their best interest, or because society needs minerals, for example, does come very often from the best of intentions, but it's still violent in these terms. It's wanting for others what they do not want at this present time for themselves. So the way this plays out is that if the mining company wins and gets its permit, my experience is that it's actually relatively easy to establish good community relations once it's inevitable that the project will go ahead. You might say that the S is okay then. We've been through a storm, but the S is okay. There is social license, public acceptance after all. But the impact of the playing out of this type of fight can be incredibly damaging in the long term. And I'm not just talking about the money that's spent and the emotional damage, but it's really typical for those involved in the fight on behalf of the mining company or the quarrying company to make concessions and offers along the way to reach a settlement. They want to get on with it. They want the project to succeed. It follows as night follows day that some or all of these will be simply undeliverable in the operational phase, safely, profitably, or even at all. Even if things settle down with the local community and other stakeholders, this is hardly a recipe for sustainability in any sense. We heard quite a lot about the systemic and cultural problems yesterday. So this cartoon indicates how, in this case, mediation based on the principles of non-violent communication can help the parties create a respectful connection that can provide the conditions in which they can co-create strategies that will resolve the dispute to both sides' satisfaction. This is not about compromise. Most approaches at resolution seek compromise, which means very, very often, usually I'd say, that everybody gives something up and neither side is satisfied. The mediator or facilitator helps to translate the language of judgment and blame and the manifestation of power imbalances into language that builds trust, empathy, and openness. Effective visionary leaders create cultures naturally where this happens. And what do we see? We see successful organizations, successful businesses, the kind of joined up vision, joined up delivery, thought about targets that are outcome focused that Elaine took us through yesterday in her talk. If you haven't heard yesterday's talks, I do recommend them all to you. The change that is facilitated is that each party feels heard and aims to understand, even if not to agree with the other party's point of view. If we understand, we can start to look at the differences and strategies to accommodate them. So the mediator and the parties here are co-creating conditions in which change and the building of solutions with consent are possible. So in my example of a mediator working with stakeholders with opposing and conflicting views, the mediator's role is not so much to resolve the dispute, but rather to help the parties to create the conditions in which they can find a way to resolve it. You can see on the right-hand side a range of skills and roles for a mediator or facilitator working in this way. training and education is key to creating systems in which this way of communicating is embedded. Resolving conflicts with the help of a trained facilitator is one thing, but truly creating a system that seeks connection, accountability, and understanding and allows for challenge in a safe and constructive way is quite another. The need for culture change, top-down clarity of purpose and vision, and accountability, the risks created by specialists working in silos, were key issues discussed in yesterday's opening session. I just want to finish there by saying two things. One is that that I value the training I've received in this area more highly than any other professional, technical, or scientific skills I've acquired in my entire career. That is not to say that my other skills are not fundamental to my professional practice. They are fundamental, and I don't regret acquiring them. But it is to say that I can use these skills and insights many times to make my scientific and technical knowledge and skills many times more effective, with the overlay, or sometimes I call it the seasoning, of these facilitative and dialogue skills. On Wednesday, Maria Arper will be presenting her dialogue roadmap as a skillful and responsible methodology for consulting with diverse stakeholders with different priorities, which is rooted in nonviolent communication. I certainly recommend listening to that talk to give you some more insights as to how this transition from debate to dialogue, from conflict to co-creation can happen. That was a whistle-stop tour, and thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ruth. So, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for the wonderful Ruth Allington. Thank you so much, Ruth. That was brilliant. And we've got a number of questions that are coming in for you now, Ruth. So the first one comes from Hugues, and it's in on the Q&A. And Hugues asks, what is the main focusing point or problem when debating with stakeholders based on your experience? They then go on to say, sometimes professional linguistic or languages can be a big problem when explaining a project to people. Any comments on that?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think the key is learning to listen more and speak less. And I find, in fact, that where there are differences in language, not only in the linguistic sense, but also in technical language and vocabulary, if those things are attended to in the way that we express ourselves, and we constantly check back, we can more easily see the opportunity. So if I say to a lawyer that I really think we need to examine the flood risk in this particular area, I will need to explain that in a way that's accessible to the lawyer, and so I need to pitch what I say, but I'm not explaining this very well. But yeah, you saw in my slides that in the cartoon of, you know, when it was all a little bit better, a dialogue, the parties were saying to each other, "What I heard you say is da 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 da." They were checking back all the time, and I find myself, because of the way I've been trained and the work that I do, I'd really recommend that. It's a route to really deeply engaging with somebody if you repeat back what you heard them say, because if it's wrong, they will correct you. If you just assume either that what you told somebody has landed in the way you intended it to land, or that what you received was what they intended for you to receive, you're almost bound to be wrong. And then you start to get a conversation going. You start to understand the other person. So nothing is wrong and nothing is right. If you go into a conversation like this, seeking to tell people stuff, it simply doesn't land. So relaxing, 2 of these, 1 of these, and remembering to use those in at least that ratio. Listening until it's almost too painful to continue listening, because you're desperate to put in your point of view. But it really pays off if you give somebody your attention by listening and then reflecting back what you heard them say. They will want to give you their attention, and at that point they will hear what you have to say.
And I guess with that as well then, Ruth, it's when you're trying to summarize or ensure that you have heard and understood correctly, not being afraid to be wrong in terms of
not being afraid to be wrong, and being very careful about judgment. So just finding ways to reflect back without judgment. So what I heard you say is that you're frightened that this tailings dam will fail and engulf your village, and frankly that's daft. I mean, you know, it's simply acknowledging how people are feeling and what they're needing. You know, trying to really get to that. What do they need? Do they need security? Do they need reassurance? Do they need money? You know, what is it that they need? And it's usually something that you might not guess at.
Brilliant. No, thank you so much for that, Ruth. And there continue to be questions coming in both chat and Q&A. And actually one of those questions is from the next speaker. So actually, rather than pose that, I'm going to take this as an opportunity to say another massive thank you to the fantastic Ruth. So ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together again for the wonderful Ruth Allington. Absolutely brilliant as always. And instead, welcome to the stage, fantastic Andy Whitmore. Now, Andy, I know that you've got some slides that you want to share. If you want to start sharing them now, because earlier on, it took a little bit of a while for the internet ether to be able to allow those slides to be shared. So Andy comes to us, and you can see the question he's posed in chat, which is around power imbalance between different people, etc. And I'm sure he may comment on that if he wants to. But as you can see here, Andy comes to us and he's going to be talking about a material transition, supply and demand solutions for renewable energy minerals. Andy will be able to introduce himself just in a second. But as a health warning, he's going to attempt to synthesize a 70-page fantastic document into 10 minutes of fantastic, wonderful speech. So Andy, over to yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thanks for the opportunity. Yes, it's something of a challenge, but I'll do my best, I hope. So I hope you can see the slides at the moment. They've come up. Right. Yep. Okay, so introduction to myself. I'm co-chair of an organisation called the London Mining Network, which I helped found. I've been working on issues around supporting local, particularly indigenous communities for around 30 years now, and currently a consultant, mainly working for a group called the Deep Sea Mining Campaign on financial advocacy. I'm also author of this report, so I'm hoping to briefly explain what's in those 70 pages, but I think particularly focusing on some key recommendations, and hopefully more can come out in the discussions later on. So London Mining Network, as I'm speaking for them mainly, I'll explain who they are. So we're a small campaigning solidarity NGO. Our aim is a just future based on lower demand for mining and on respect for human rights and ecological justice where mining does take place. We have around 21 member groups, including War on Want, who published the report. The reason we focus on UK and London particularly is because London's the world's largest centre for investment in mining, with some of the major mining companies here and organisations like the London Metal Exchange. I'll start with defining the problem. Most of us are probably aware of this. Most of us are coming now, in terms of global campaigning, are coming at the situation from a focus of climate issues. So on this slide, we've got two graphs on the right-hand side, which show the exponential growth of CO2 and energy use. And so all of that's fairly well known. I think what we want to do is to stress the slide on the left, which is it's on a slightly different time scale. It's a shorter time scale, but it shows the growth of, for instance, steel, copper, and zinc from about 1960 to 2010, and it's tripled in that time. I think what we have here is an issue not just of climate, but materials. So we are talking about a large number of extractive processes that also contribute to, for instance, biodiversity, environmental crisis, land theft, human rights abuses, etc. And it's worth stressing that natural resources as a whole, our use have tripled since 1970 and seem to be on that exponential growth. But we would argue that we can't mine our way out of a climate crisis. So it's not just an energy crisis, it's a materials crisis. So as the name of the report suggests, what we're looking for is a material transition. It's interesting that the industry at the moment seems to be using this as an opportunity to basically shift from black to green. So, from fossil fuels through coal through to green energy. Now, obviously, some of that is a positive thing. However, I think many companies are basically using this as a cloak, effectively, for greenwashing. I mean, many of these companies are still involved in fossil fuel production, and also the minerals are used for any number of industries, including the military. But there's a focus just on this idea that they are providing minerals for the green transition. What we're concerned about is, having worked with communities for many years, is this idea of a new frontier of green extractivism opening up. So that's the idea that human rights and ecosystems are going to be sacrificed to mining in the name of solving climate change. Before talking about that a bit more, just to stress what we're talking about in terms of what transition minerals are. I mean, we use the word transition minerals. Sometimes people talk about critical or strategic. Actually, I would argue they're slightly different when we go into the definitions. But for us, transition minerals are those highlighted as essential for the energy transition. So we're talking about minerals for the actual hardware involved, like wind turbines, solar panels, geothermal. And we're talking huge amounts there. And a single 3 megawatt wind turbine needs about 335 tons of steel, 5 tons of copper, 3 tons of aluminium, and up to 2 tons of rare earths. So if you amplify that number we need of wind turbines, and then the amount of ore that's dug up for the materials used, then you're obviously talking about significant amounts. Then the second is on batteries for storage, be that in vehicles, be that on the energy grid, etc. And I think the way that's received most focus, so we're talking about lithium, cobalt, and nickel, because their growth curves are massive, considering the relatively smaller amounts that were used of them. I think comparatively the amount of damage may be less, but that's very much arguable. Also, it's difficult to know at the moment how much disruptive innovation will change demand, how much substitution there'll be for the materials that go into batteries. And then the third area that's oddly enough often overlooked is the transmission itself. And I think we're talking particularly copper there for power grids, etc. So all of this, as mentioned earlier, we're talking huge amounts. I mean, it's estimated about 3 billion tons of minerals and metals are going to be needed for the switch to renewables. So what would this mean? Well, this green extractivism I mentioned, we would say it's pretty much like the old one, but a supercharged version of it. So we're talking about the potential for communities and ecosystems to be sacrificed. And those are certainly based on the past. Those have mainly been in the global south in the previous decade, and also within indigenous territories in the global north, so in Canada, Australia, the US. This map is we produced for the report. It's indicative of certain case studies. We could have done much more, but you have trouble fitting case studies onto a map, obviously. We have within the report 2 specific case studies we cover in depth on nickel mining in the Philippines and Indonesia. So we could have chosen anywhere from cases from deserts of Argentina through to the rainforests of West Papua. I think the other thing that's worth stressing before moving on is just that, it's not just in the global south. I think sort of the old world, be it Europe, be it United States, looks like there's going to be an increased need for mining. And, even Europe, where I'm based, there's now potentially conflicted projects in lithium in Spain, Portugal and Serbia, and rare earths in Sweden. So it'll be interesting to see how those move forward as well. Having kind of addressed the problem, we look at three particular areas, which I'll go over in the three next slides. First one is, because we're really focused on communities, is about solidarity with communities in struggle. We would also stress that many of these communities, particularly Indigenous communities, are kind of showing us the way to live. They're actually showing examples of how we live in less energy intensive ways, in more democratic ways, and with more of a sort of essential idea of the elements for a dignified life. And the phrase buen vivir is often used in Latin America, Indigenous Latin America, for this idea of basically how to live well. I mean, we would argue most of that is focused around supporting communities on their rights to free, prior informed consent, or the right to say no for communities in general. In the next area we look at with supply side solutions. So we had a pretty extensive attempt to create tables, one of which is on the left, of all of the different types of laws, of different frameworks, of different points, etc., binding laws, voluntary frameworks, etc. I think what we came up with was just noting, I think it's not a new idea, but the sheer number of the laws and schemes means consolidation and coordination is really desperately needed. And to do that, suppliers and manufacturers should really be working with civil society, particularly impacted communities, to ensure the effectiveness and legitimacy of these sort of due diligence initiatives. Perhaps more importantly, we would argue there's a sort of level of mandatory compliance required in schemes if they're going to have any credibility. So effectively, we're looking for more binding mechanisms that would respect human rights. And we have examples of that coming up in some countries' legislations, but particularly the European Union is now looking to enshrine a law covering that. On the demand side, we go through a number of practical solutions that could be sort of initiated or accelerated to enable better informed choices. I think it's clear that what we're talking about is some more structural change, really. The author, George Monbiot, has a great phrase, which, excuse my language, but he talks about micro-consumerist works, which is this idea that you're kind of focused just on what cotton buds you choose, whereas much larger issues go to one side. I think what we need is ambitious changes, effectively leading to a circular economy. So the idea that we're going to reuse, remake, repurpose, and eventually recycle as much as possible. However, the report notes that we don't think it's enough just to switch to like a green growth model of the circular economy, because effectively the idea that we can just swap electrical vehicles from internal combustion ones, but just keep producing more and more of them. And we're going to need to have a kind of radical reduction of unsustainable consumption and a questioning really of consumption based on effectively on global north economies and lifestyle. And we would argue that this kind of review is effectively a circular society. So the circular society is not my idea. It came out of an academic paper that I read, and I thought it summed up very well that people were trying to come up with different definitions of what the circular economy is, because people have different definitions. And this idea of like you could still be a circular economy, still be closed loop, be continually growing. Whereas this idea that we are definitely reaching the boundaries of planetary boundaries in terms of what we can take. Therefore, a circular society is one that looks more at the idea of wealth and power, technology, looks at commons, ownership, sharing, equality. Is a much more comprehensive than just assuming everything can be solved by trying to just create a single closed loop. That's pretty much it. In conclusions, or main asks of the report came out in a number of these recommendations. Basically, we need a global effort to bring together those most affected by the problems in the heart of the transition minerals. And a lot of this is based around an idea to have a global Green New Deal. So at the moment, countries are very much focused on their own Green New Deals, but if we have a kind of global principles around it, that would be one way to move forward. Within those, we're looking for international solidarity for those impacted by transition minerals. They won't be forgotten or sacrificed. Advanced initiatives to ensure fair and just global supply chains for renewable energy technologies, and perhaps most importantly, reviewing a fundamental societal change to reduce unsustainable material consumption. So that's it. Thank you very much for the time. I would leave you both with a graphic that we've got that kind of like explains in a way the movement towards this idea of going beyond extractivist economies. Also, thinking that although the type of change I've talked about seems pretty far reached, I mean, we would argue that things are moving forward rapidly in some areas, and members of the European Parliament have already voted to push for legally binding targets to reduce resource use by 2030 and to bring EU consumption within planetary boundaries by 2050. So there are movements going forward, and I think it's just a case of being what looks like incredibly optimistic is actually realistic in terms of the situation we're in. Okay, thank you very much.
Brilliant. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Andy. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the fantastic Andy Whitmore. Brilliant. So, Andy, first question out the gate with regards to your report. I saw that there was a URL. Is that something that is freely available, or where can people get hold of it?
It is freely available, and when I've finished, I'll, unless Rose does it, I'll put the link back into the chat so that people can get hold of it. Clearly, with 70 pages and actually a couple of other annexes, it will give you some time to look after. But there are a couple of very good summaries. So yeah, hopefully you don't have to dip into everything.
Excellent. No, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Andy. And I don't know, Rose is maybe being polite and letting you post that URL. I don't know, there's going to be competition going on behind the scenes here. So with that as well, Andy, because, obviously in order for us to be able to achieve what you just set out, it requires lots and lots of different people to come to the table and to do their bit. And as we've been hearing already today and yesterday, it is an iterative approach. Do you see that there's any particular stakeholder or groups of stakeholders that actually need to really step up right now? Because actually, if they don't step up, they are preventing this progress that we need. I mean, is there any one particular area that you're seeing as being a blocker, or do you think it's just everybody actually needs to get on and do it?
It's a really difficult one. But I think in a way we're still in a situation where there's a battle of ideas going on. And as I mentioned, the sorts of ideas I'm talking about, are fairly radical. They're often within this idea of degrowth, which is a name I hate. I mean, the idea came out of French intellectuals, and it was very much the idea that what we needed to do was to decouple ourselves from an idea that our societies needed to be focused constantly on growth. So that's actually not very radical when you break it down. It's actually saying what we need to live well, because we're in this situation at the moment where people are saying electric vehicles are the answer, and yet we're already building these huge SUVs that are going to continue to take. So I mean, I think we it's going to be very interesting that we need that messaging, and I haven't seen many people. There's a couple of groups in Germany, but I haven't seen many people formulate the sorts of things we're saying in the way we're saying it. That messaging that people are really up to the idea of an energy transition. I don't think people have the point yet where they're thinking a materials transition. So clearly within that, mining companies are possibly going to be the most difficult, because their job is effectively to perpetuate this linear model, to take the minerals out. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be that way all the way through. In a long time, many years ago at a Chatham House meeting, I remember asking mining company people, whether they would consider switching more towards, being part of a recycling economy, etc. So, and I think there are companies that certainly see that as a vision. I think it is very difficult. So many of them are seeing this perhaps more as a marketing opportunity than an opportunity of, reevaluation.
So spin rather than reality, perhaps, being there. Just in terms of, I guess, looking for the happy space over the last 12 months or so. I mean, of course, this time last year, everybody was saying everyone's going to forget about climate change because we're all going to be caring about the economy and COVID. And actually 12 months down the line, we actually see almost the opposite of that. And people going, well, no, we've used this period of lockdown, etc., which most of us are still in, to actually almost evaluate some of that. Do you see, are there any particular areas that you'd like to highlight where there really has been some positive movement over the last 12 months, or do you think it's still too early to tell? As in, has there been anything happen over the last 12 months that you see has gone, awesome, that looks like we're moving in the right direction?
Yeah, and I think at the community level, very often bad things have been done because companies are still pushing through, with projects where, so it's very interesting that I was once on a webinar that asked people pretty much split between the global south and the global north, and the global south was much more negative, and the global north that had this experience of us being in car-free areas was, without planes going overhead, was great. So I think there have been many, but having said that, I think there have been many positive points for those of us who live here. And I think it is interesting that it has given people time to reflect. I think seeing that governments have mobilised on a massive scale, there's hope that they can also mobilise on that massive scale around climate change as well. So it'll be interesting to see, if we have that shift. But personally, I believe it's made it easier. And also interestingly, just on how I mentioned that buen vivir idea, I think it has helped formulate within people's minds what the priorities are, and do we want a society built on well-being? And I think again that may well help us shift as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very, very much, Andy. As someone who relocated from London to a little off-grid shed in the northeast of Scotland, and so therefore is attempting to live off-grid, which is easier said than done when you're in Scotland, where it's not very sunny, so photovoltaic cells aren't great. And if it's not windy, the wind turbine isn't fantastic. So yes, please bring on the battery power storage technology. But Andy, thank you very, very much. Ladies and gents, put your hands together for the fantastic Andy Whitmore. Brilliant. Thank you, Andy. Next, we have the fantastic Murray Hitzman, who, as you can see, is so well practiced at giving these talks. He's already shared his slides. So thank you very much for that, Murray. Murray comes to us from the wonderful world of iCrag, and building on a lot of what we've heard this morning, but in fact, nobody's really mentioned it yet, is one of the aspects of mining that is perhaps one of the most difficult, and that is how on earth do you responsibly close that mine? Because we are extracting non-renewable resources from the ground, we don't have any intention of putting back all of those materials as we found them, but how do you leave that patch of land in the same, or if not better, state in which we found it? So Murray, I'm going to hand over to your wonderful self. Ladies and gents, please put your hands together for the fantastic Murray Hitzman. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you, Sarah. I'm actually not going to talk so much about the closure. I'm going to talk about the initial part. So this is a history lesson from 31 years ago. And I want to thank speakers earlier this morning, Hugues for showing us, how actually transitions are occurring and very quickly in the industry and how we're doing it. And Andy for actually having the real question of how do we actually deal with materials long term. And one of the things I guess I hope that happens is we certainly have to find ways of extracting that are very economic, so the people doing it can make serious money and the societies around it can actually benefit and are the least disruptive. So I think we have a real challenge going forward, and I'm just going to show you an example from a long time ago and see if it teaches anything. So part of this is a history lesson. I was working at the time for Chevron. This was back in the 1980s, and we had come in June. We worked across the country. I was an American working in a different country. I hired a lot of Irish consultants. I was the only person from Chevron doing the project on the ground. We worked in Central Ireland, the Midlands, what we called the Dublin Basin, for several years. And then in January, a deposit discovery was announced at Galmoy. And we very quickly actually came down and looked at this area and started extending our work through the area. And I looked at the drill core in June, sort of 6 months afterwards. Are my slides being shared?
No, they're not at the moment, Murray. You took
okay,
them off,
let me, I thought I had, so let me escape and share them. Can you see them now?
Not quite yet, but I'm sure they will come with time.
Okay, just a second. No, there's a real problem then if they're not there. Let me do it again.
So just while Murray is sharing his slides, as you can hear, Murray has huge experience. Here we go, Murray, they're beginning to come now. Huge experience with regards to all of this area. So this is a brilliant history lesson. Thank you very much, Murray. And we can see your slides.
Great, good. Okay, so we started in Central Ireland and Galmoy was found. We came down, I looked at it 6 months afterwards, started talking to the company about a joint venture, but we also applied for ground around. Historically, we found there was a large anomaly to the north of Galmoy, which the operators didn't know about. We shared that. And we also found there was another anomaly after we had acquired the ground here to the west and south. And so in 1987, when we could actually have the licenses and got on the ground, we covered it with geophysics and with some geochemistry. And basically at this point, we had almost very, very little impact. Obviously talking to the farmers about where the geophysical lines went and doing the geochemistry. So we identified Lachine by the end of September 1987. But then between 1988 and 1990, Chevron got cold feet, cut back exploration. I was moved back to Canada and basically nothing happened. In March 1990, we signed a joint venture with a small Irish group to basically explore Lachine. That was the highest priority target. So in March, I came back and we started drilling. Our first drill hole hit this weird looking rock over here, which we now call black matrix breccia, which had a touch of zinc in it. And we then decided to actually drill on every side of this hole 500 meters away to see which direction we should vector. So we drilled to the south and hit the same sort of rock. That was good, still not much zinc. We drilled to the north and hit a little bit of this red stuff, which we've seen at other ore deposits in Ireland. And we drilled to the east and we lost the hole and it was abandoned before hitting the target. We drilled to the west and found that it was unmineralized. We also drilled to the far south where we had another geophysical anomaly and found that the target horizon was very close to the surface. So there had to be some sort of fault between our initial drilling area and this hole down here. So in late March, early April, another hole was sighted basically 500 meters to the south within a farmer's field shown here in orange. A farmer was a great guy. And so I asked him where do we want to drill in all four corners of his field, which one should we drill first? He picked the southeast because it was the same time of year as now. And basically it was very wet and that corner of the field was the highest and the driest. So he picked the discovery hole. That hole began drilling the last week of March. That same week, Chevron announced it was getting out of the minerals business. And so I was recalled to Vancouver. Basically, I was about to be fired. So I was looking for a new job and interviewing. The hole actually collared very high in the stratigraphy, so we knew it was going to be a deep hole. On April 3rd, the hole penetrated 2 meters of semi-massive sulfides and entered that same black matrix breccia rock, contained sulfides. I talked by phone to the person who just come from the rig. They thought there was some sphalerite in the hole. Turns out the sphalerite at Lachine is very pale, and so he mistook it for dolomite. He thought it might be an economic intersection, but as the drilling was stopped at 6 o'clock that evening, I had him describe the core to me. It sounded pretty good, so I broke off my job interviews, and on April the 3rd, got an airplane to London and to Dublin. The hole was completed while I was in the air, and it actually intersected 6 meters of 15% zinc and 4.3 meters of almost 30% zinc. So it was clearly a pretty good hole. We then decided to drill a step out hole, and I wanted to continue 500 meter step outs. We drilled to the north of that discovery hole. The farmer picked that hole. I asked him which of the 3 remaining holes he'd like to drill. He picked that one next, and it ended up being a duster, hit almost nothing. So Ivernia, the joint venture partner, got cold feet, and we actually initially had 10 meter step outs, which I eventually got to 30 meter step outs from the original hole. By the end of June, we had 2 rigs, and then we increased to 60 meters. And at the end of 1990, we went to 120 meters and we had 3 rigs. In the spring of 1991, with the big step outs, we could actually finally find the guts of the deposits down near the fault to the south. And from this point on, we had significant local impacts, basically on the traffic in the area, which were all very small roads. And during that spring, we also found another ore body called the Dairyville. So just on a map, here's the original holes. Here's the discovery hole. Here's the hole in the northeast corner that missed. You can see it's surrounded by what later became the deposit. And by the end of the year, by 1991, we'd gotten down here and found the main part. So the resource stood at 15 million tons of 12.5% zinc, clearly looking like it's going to be economic. So what was happening on the social side? So environmental monitoring was started in June. We drilled the discovery hole in April at the site, and we rented a local house and put in an environmental field equipment and weather station, et cetera. We started looking at the land tenure situation at the end of June, when we had a second rig come on, because in Ireland, people can't own mineral rights themselves as well as the state. We had a number of locals hired as laborers for the drilling and for our geophysical consultants. And our first locals that were really technical people were hired for logging and geotechnical work, and we were training them. They came on board at the end of that first year, 1990. We had consultations taking place basically on a daily basis with many of the local farmers regarding siting of drill holes. And while we wanted to drill in a regular grid, of course, there were a whole bunch of reasons why we couldn't do that. Farmers had things in various parts of the field, there were houses, et cetera. So we worked with them to accommodate their wishes. And by this point, most of the permitting and talking to the farmers was not myself, it was actually locals we'd hired that helped us. A local building was purchased and converted to a core store and a laboratory at the end of the year. So by 1991, we had 5 drill rigs operating. We had locals hired to permit the holes, ensure water lines to drilling were in place, not hindering farmers. And we had one individual who became a mediator, harking back to the talk we heard just a couple of minutes ago. A second house was leased for a larger field office in the immediate area, and a house was rented in Thurles, the biggest local town, for our geologists. The joint venture during 1991 hired a huge number of engineering, environmental, hydrologic, and social experts to help us prepare the EIS. And we had monthly meetings of that group starting in June. A town hall was held in Temple Tui, the local village, and a meeting room in our bigger field office was open to the public to answer questions or for those seeking information. And a number of people actually came to that office sort of between June and November, but then it started petering out as people sort of understood what was happening. We had printed information, originally a monthly newsletter on the project that was prepared and sent to over 30 local, county, and national groups to explain what we were doing. And we had a whole host of local groups, including the Irish Countrywomen's Association, the Irish Farmers Association, several local angling groups, the GAA, local parishes, et cetera. And we were in regular contact with Tipperary County Council and a whole number of other government groups as well. And importantly, there were groups that were concerned with mining. There was an anti-mining group at Galmoy just up the road. We actually interacted with them. And there was an anti-mining group in the Wicklow's, which we invited to see the project as well. And at that time, Greenpeace was active in the country, so they were invited too. From 1992 to 1993, there was a continuation of the on-ground interaction, a lot more hiring of locals. Oh, let me just go back and say, I hate to say, we literally drilled in people's backyards too, and front yards as well, obviously with permission. In 1992 to 1993, the newsletter was discontinued due to an apparent lack of interest, but we did still have an open door policy at the field office. Fewer and fewer visitors came, but that was okay, it was open. Chevron itself, as a part of the joint venture, worked proactively with the government agencies on the environmental requirements, and I'll come to that in a minute. And by mid-1992, we had a very large team, about 350 people, technical people working on this project, and regular meetings of the project team with the county council and with Irish government officials. And the image here, actually, which shows the ore bodies in red, the brown is bog, which was worked by Bord na Móna for peat. This actually has the mine on it. You'll notice the tailings facility, which is this blue patch here with the gray, was actually built on worked tailings. And this was an innovative solution. I don't think we'd ever, anywhere in the world, built the tailings facilities on peat to utilize the peat actually as a capture of metals, another part underneath our lining to help ensure that there would actually be no toxic metal release. And we worked with Borden and Mona on that and a number of peat experts from around the world. So we were proactive with the permitting process. EISs came into Ireland due to European regulations in 1989, the year before the discovery. And the JV began its EIS in 1991, less than a year after discovery and basically 2 years after it was required in the country. Now, EPA, the actual EPA agency, was established in Ireland in 1992, so a year after the discovery. And the joint venture, but really Chevron, worked with the new EPA to ensure that the regulations they put in place for Lachine and other mining operations actually met or exceeded those that were in place in the United States at the time. The Lachine project was the first major project of any type to be considered by the Irish EPA. And I just want to, this is a paper that was published by two then government officials in 1998. And it explains that the completion of the EIS, the planning and the IPCL applications were submitted in 1996 following extensive and mutually beneficial process of consultation with regulatory authorities and local interests. The developers have been very proactive with local residents, and there's very little significant opposition. Basically, the planning permission for Lachine went through in record time. So this history, what we did in the joint venture might seem like standard practice today. I mean, this is the sort of thing that everybody should do, right? But I can tell you at the time leading it, it was not standard practice. And I had incredible pushback from both Chevron and our joint venture partners because we were so proactive with the locals and the government officials. But the end result really did show the value of transparency. So, you know, that's the reason people are doing these things today. But the point of my talk is, the question is, what should we be doing now in 2021 with minerals projects that will seem normal for raw materials projects in 2050? So 30 years ago, what we did at Lachine, I'm very proud of it. I think it was something that was just coming on board with companies. It is now standard practice and we go beyond it. But what other things should we be going way beyond now, looking to the future to make sure we can answer the questions that Andy had in his last talk? So thanks for listening, and thank you, Sarah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Murray. A massive round of applause from all of us on the other side of our muted microphones. That was brilliant. And wow, talk about a whistle-stop tour through a phenomenal case study. I think for anybody who is studying geology or anything like that at university or mining at university, what Murray has just achieved in 10 minutes, that was a brilliant case study. And we've got a couple of questions, actually, Murray, that are coming in. One that comes in from Hugues, and Hugues asks, related to social management during the operation of the mine. It's not necessarily related to your topic, so you can tell that I haven't actually read this question yet, but let's go for it. In the history of Lachine, there were two big accidents during the operation, and this was really important for planning during the life of mine. So by the way, everybody, LOM means life of mine, in terms of that. So after these accidents, was there any impact for management of social consciousness? And if so, how was this managed? So I guess you've got that linkage between the safety and the social consciousness there.
Well, let me say that I left the project in 1993, so I wasn't involved in the mine itself. I certainly followed what was happening, and I remember those two accidents well, even though I was in the United States. From what I understand and what I know of the people at the mine, yes, both were taken incredibly seriously, and big safety reviews were conducted to try and understand, you know, what had happened and why. I must say that's typical these days at mining operations, so it's not unusual. I wasn't in the local community, so I don't know what happened locally, but I am sure, well, I know most of them, both accidents had real impact, yes.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Murray. And I guess actually building on that as well, because very often with regards to safety, we're all told, you know, you all have a right to stop if you think that things look unsafe, etc. But often it takes a lot of guts to be able to do the right thing rather than just to conform to what everybody else is doing round about you. And I guess that's actually what you guys were doing when you were setting Lachine up, is that you had to actually go beyond perhaps the norm to do things right. And I guess with regards to that, so I think you noted that the EPA, so the Environmental Protection Agency, was only set up after discovery. So have you got any more examples or any comments with regards to how far you guys had to go outside of the normal boundaries actually to do this thing right?
So that's where Chevron really was nervous, as you can imagine, because I was trying to get people from the United States who knew about these things to talk to people in Ireland about what the experiences were, so how Ireland could jumpstart and go right to the front of the queue in terms of their environmental regulations. I'm very proud we did that, but yeah, that was pretty edgy at the time.
And I guess that's something as well, especially a big company like Chevron, there's almost more to lose in a way if they do something a little bit outside of the norm for one particular project. The cross impact across to their other operations and projects might be quite significant.
It could be, and this is where you need to have, one, a good boss who trusts you, and two, at that time, I was very, very proud of Chevron. We had the CEO come over to visit Lachine twice during this period, and having that sort of visibility in the company, he wanted it done right. So, you know, yeah, it can be done. So big companies can be both a problem and a real advantage. It can work both ways. Right.
Yeah, and I guess that talks to quite a lot of what we heard yesterday from the likes of Elaine and Ludovine, by saying actually leadership need to lead by example. And if you're saying something like safety or whatever is the number one priority, then you've got to mean it. And you've got to be able to empower your entire workforce and beyond to be able to live that.
Yep.
So brilliant. There's so many more questions, Murray, that I could ask you just from my list of questions. But unfortunately, or fortunately, we need to move on to the wonderful next speaker. So ladies and gents, please put your hands together for the wonderful Murray Hitzman. So round of applause. Thank you very much, Murray. Brilliant. And next, we're going to stick with that topic of geology. And don't worry, for those of you who maybe aren't geologists or geoscientists, we will continue to interpret the language within the chat and explain any terms that are being mentioned. Next, we have the fantastic John Russell, who is coming to us. So John is an exploration geologist in his own right, but he's actually going to speak to us about the InFact project. So one of those European Union Horizon 2020 projects that Victor alluded to early on. So John, if you'd like to make sure your mute is off, as it were, so we can hear you, and feel free to introduce yourself and then crack on with your talk. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Sarah. It's good to see you all again, and good to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. Can you all hear me okay, first of all?
Yeah, we can. Thanks, John.
Great. So yeah, I'm John Russell. I'm a exploration geologist, and I work with SRK Exploration Services, based here in South Wales in the UK. So we're part of the SRK group, which is a worldwide consulting firm for the exploration and mining industry. And our part of SRK specializes just in the exploration process. And we provide advice to our clients who are taking on exploration projects. And we also provide exploration services. So we tend to get involved with projects from the initial concept, choosing an exploration area, all the way through to the point of defining a mineral resource. So that's the first stage where you've got an idea of the, you could call it your discovery of a mineral deposit. So we were, over the last 3 years, we've been involved with a Horizon 2020 funded project called InFact, which came to a close at the end of January this year. And it was a fascinating process for everyone involved. I learned a huge amount, which has been integrated into SRK's work now. So some real positive impacts in that regard. And InFact was part of Europe's call to try to examine ways in which the Europe's raw material supply could be sourced closer to home and in a more responsible manner. And so we sought to look at how the exploration process as a whole could be made to be more acceptable in a place like Europe, where there are some unique challenges in being able to do this type of work. So there were three strands to it, really. Was to engage society, so looking at new ways of stakeholder engagement, invigorating exploration, starting from understanding what the challenges to exploration are in this area, and how those could be overcome or mitigated, and then also finding ways of developing new technologies. So I was mainly involved with this middle strand here, which was looking at how the exploration process itself could change or evolve to be better suited to a region like Europe. But I think that the outcomes of this can be applied worldwide. So I've got a very simple presentation with one slide, which is a product that we developed that we've called the Exploration Decision Tree. Okay, so the idea of this is to we want to demonstrate how good ESG practice, so good environmental, social, and governance practice, should be integrated from the very outset of an exploration program. What we often see is that ESG considerations are only really with the current business model, or the current way operations are run. And I think Murray was an ironic exception to this. He's way ahead of his time with the way he ran that program. But currently, these sorts of considerations are often only dealt with at relatively advanced stages, off the bottom of this chart that we have here, where you've got your mineral resource and you're thinking about the next stages, such as a scoping study, where you're really evaluating whether the project is viable or not. That's often the first time that people really take notice of the environmental and social context of the area they're working in, by which time several tens of millions of dollars may have been spent. And to the investor's point of view, the project has passed the point of no return. But at the same time, the social and environmental issues are, they're now very focused on a particular area, and it becomes increasingly difficult to mitigate any challenges that you may find there. So we argue that this type of evaluation needs to take place much earlier. So I'm going to walk you through this decision tree and show you where some of the key decisions along the exploration process are, and where we're introducing ESG decisions as well. And we also show how these have the power to, or should have the power to be considered and with the same sort of weight as technical considerations, geological considerations, and potentially be able to stop projects or at least give reason to pause a project. So we start at the top here with an initial idea. So you're say, for example, you want to go and look for lithium deposits or any other critical raw materials. That's my focus, critical raw materials. But you want to pick an area. You may have chosen a country or part of a continent that you want to focus on. So you start with a prospectivity review. So this can all be done from your office. And you amass as much geological data and remote sensing data as you can, and you start to make some decisions as to whether this area holds the potential for the type of mineralization that you're looking for. If it does, you might home in your area to, say, the scale of a license area that you might consider applying for. So we're talking about maybe several tens or 100 square kilometers, for example. Now, at this point, you should consider doing what we call a ESG critical factor review. So this doesn't necessarily need a site visit. This is something, particularly in a place like Europe, which is blessed with an incredibly rich amount of data to access. You can do all of this remotely, and this is even before you've selected your license area or at least applied for it. So you can review that area and start to understand the environmental and social context that you're going to be working in. and understand if there's any critical challenges in there, critical factors in there, which could really influence the way your project is going to develop. And if there are some critical factors in there which clearly cannot be overcome, then you move on. You find another area, and you haven't spent, you've spent very, very little money at this point, and you've got the opportunity to move on and choose another area. If it's all looking good, then you can move forward and engage with local authorities, start talking about finance with people, and get in some license applications. Once you've got your license applications in, then your team of geologists will go out and start doing that first phase of field work, so reconnaissance exploration. So this is just familiarizing yourself with the area. But I think we think at this point you should bring along a social practitioner with you. They should be part of that first field team, so that they can start talking to regulatory authorities as well. They can start understanding in real life what the environmental and social context is on the ground, and start to provide some recommendations as to how the exploration program should be performed, to accounting for those factors. All of those findings, and this is where the holistic approach comes in, should be integrated. So your field report should include obviously your observations of the geology and the mineral potential, but also your ESG findings and what that means for the process going forwards. Let's hope that everything is positive and you haven't found any fatal flaws yet, and you can move forward to the main meat of the exploration program. So you've got logistical considerations here, noting health and safety, technical considerations. So these are the types of work you might be doing at this stage, from reconnaissance type work all the way through to drilling. And then ESG. So the ESG side of things here is again, it's really building up your understanding of the context. So understanding who your stakeholders are in that area. Coming up with an early engagement plan, a grievance mechanism. How do you manage complaints about your drilling program, for example, or your geologists wandering all over the fields? A data management system. Everything needs to be recorded well, and you need to be able to evidence that in future. Natural resource use. How do you protect that? Are there water sources nearby? Is there farmlands? Murray was an excellent example there of working with farmers to minimize impacts to them. You need a continuous dialogue with your stakeholders, and all of that needs to be evidenced. This will put you streets ahead when it comes further down the line to your social impact assessment and environmental impact assessment. You will already have a really good understanding of the main of the social setting and environmental setting of the area that you're working in. But most importantly as well, this continuous dialogue builds up trust and tolerance with people who live and work in the area. They get to know you, you get to know them, and if you do that in an open and transparent way, they're much more likely to accept you being in that area and allow you to continue your work, because you'll be doing it in a way which hopefully ideally benefits them. You're part of this process, which we'll be talking about later today, is identifying shared value as well, and how you can deliver other benefits other than development of your mineral project. But it's all about building relationships and taking them forward with you on this journey. So again, after this, the main bulk of exploration, which may go on for a couple of years, you collate all of this, and again, you're looking at things through a very holistic lens, taking into account all of your technical outcomes and your ESG results as well. And then you just have some simple decisions to make. Is it all positive? Great, you move on. You validate that target, and that might be some early stage economic analysis, for example. And then you produce your mineral resource estimate. That's the point at which this this process stops. And what we'll see in a lot of these mineral resource reporting codes, such as PERC or JORC or SAMREC, for example, I think what we're going to see in the future are the environmental and social modifying factors. As geologists, we're used to seeing economic modifying factors going into part of the resource definition process, but we're going to start to see ESG modifying factors as well. If you follow this process and you've considered the ESG context of your project from the outset, then you will be miles ahead in terms of being able to provide answers to those. And again, if you've got, if everything's negative, you need to consider if those findings, those difficulties are mitigable. If they are, you mitigate and you move on. If they're not, then you stop. Okay, a project should not be. If you're finding these sorts of serious issues at this stage of an exploration project, you shouldn't just plow on. You really should consider walking away, because those sorts of problems are just going to become more and more embedded, and you're kicking the can down the road and dealing with them later and later on. And meanwhile, you've spent more and more money on the project. So we think that this approach to exploration, where you have a team of geologists and environmental practitioners and social practitioners going through this process together in a really well integrated way. Ideally, it will lead to a de-risked project, a higher value project, or sorry, reduced risk project of higher value, where stakeholders and investors are equally happy with the outcomes. That's my that's the ideal outcome, obviously, but equally it does demonstrate that there are several points along this process where you should really pause and think and consider walking away. So that's my exploration decision tree. I do hope you enjoyed it. I hope that this is all accessible via the INFAC website. You can download this infographic, and there's some reports behind it as well, which explain a bit more about the each of these stages and what sort of people you could access to help you with these sorts of things. Okay, happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, John. Absolutely fantastic. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the wonderful John Russell. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And also just as well to remind everybody that any questions that you've got, please post them into the Q&A or into the chat, or if you're watching on YouTube, do post them in the chat there as well, and we will attempt to bring them into our discussion, as well as questions from Twitter, LinkedIn, and any other channels, smoke signals, homing pigeons, stuff like that, all will be accepted. So John, in terms of this flow, you alluded to it, there have been quite significant updates going on within the likes of, so the European Code of Reporting or standard or guidelines for reporting on mineral resources and reserves, but then also all of the others are being updated as well to perhaps include ESG in a more meaningful manner. How does this fit with those updates that are happening at the moment?
I think if we've had some insight as to what these updates could include in the future. We've been part of that discussion as well, through SRK and the INFAC project, and I think that if you followed this process and have these specialists involved from the outset, also you're training up geologists to behave better or not behave better, but to have more capabilities in this regard, then I really do think that you'll come out at the resource reporting stage where you have to consider what the reporting requirements are. And I think you'll find you'll tick a lot of the boxes that are going to be asked if you've built up that level of information about your environmental and social context. You understand your stakeholders, you understand what the opportunities and risks to your project are. I actually think you'll be in pretty good shape to answer a lot of the questions that will that are going to be posed in updates to these reporting codes. So really, they'll be looking for material factors from an environmental and social and governance perspective, which could affect the chances of your mineral resource becoming economically viable. So this is your reasonable prospects for eventual economic extraction.
So with that as well then, John, because obviously as soon as you start bringing in specialists to help you, if you're a tiny little company, that's going to cost a huge amount of money relative to the budget you've got. Is this something here where actually almost as the founders of a junior company or a project, you should have somebody who brings that expertise, or is it something that the geoscientists or the people who bring the money actually should have that expertise within themselves? Which way do you think that going?
Yeah, two good questions there. First of all, on the cost, it's not a huge amount of money that we're talking about here. It's compared to some of the exploration approaches you might use, this is order of magnitude lower cost. If you compare a geophysical survey, for example, to a early stage ESG context scan or risk assessment, honestly, it's not a great deal of money. And our view is that the value of doing that, or doing that, reduces risk of the project to the point where it increases the value quite substantially, by substantially more than you've paid for that sort of work to be carried out. So I think owners of these projects, these small junior companies, they really need to recognise the value add that this approach can bring. So that's one reason not to worry too much about the additional cost. I really do think they'll see it back in spades. Secondly, should geologists be doing this kind of work? Ideally not, but in real life, yes, they will be. We see it all the time where geologists, sometimes junior geologists, even brand new graduates, they're the first people in the field, first people to start meeting local stakeholders, and that could possibly be the case for some time yet. They do need the skills to be able to deal with this sort of thing. So I think it's a responsibility of their employers to equip them with those skills, or at the very least, give them a good narrative, a consistent narrative that they can tell to local stakeholders, so that everyone is emitting the same message and recording responses in the right way. Okay, that's not too difficult for geologists, even geologists, to do. Equally, I think that in educational, on the educational side of things, geologists, undergraduate geologists, would really benefit from more content like this in their courses. So they come out of their degrees or their masters with some understanding of the importance of ESG and how to go about this type of engagement. Ideally, though, as I said, you would like to involve experts from the outset if you can. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, John. So actually, in terms of our next speaker, he is a geologist who also does a lot of what we're about to hear is exactly how he's been interacting with the local community, etc. So, I mean, I think, Rowan, you first went out to Liberia, which what we're about to hear about, with that geologist hat on. But actually, as we're going to hear, you've actually been spending most of your time working with the local community and building that relationship there as well. So, but firstly, a massive thank you to John. Thank you so much. And congratulations to the InFact team on that brilliant decision-making tree that you've got there. Brilliant.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Cool. And moving swiftly into the wonderful Rowan. Now, Rowan is a geologist, as I just mentioned, and has, well, recently, and within the last few months, returned from a fantastic field trip to Liberia. And Rowan is going to, I guess, tell us his story. So, ladies and gents, put your hands together for the fantastic Rowan Thorne. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. I think I'll start with a bit of background of myself. As Sarah mentioned, I'm an exploration geologist. I've been working in the industry for about 8 years now, since I've left university. I've worked in many different jurisdictions, from Finland to Canada to Armenia, Sierra Leone. My most recent venture was out in Liberia working for a new exploration company called Origin Exploration. So our focus right now is greenfields exploration in the country of Liberia. What I will do is I will focus primarily on the ESG aspect and how the geologist has to engage in the ESG side of the industry. I'm just going to share my screen and put my PowerPoint up and share my screen. Okay, and talk around this. Right, can everyone see my screen? Is that okay?
Yeah, we can see it in PowerPoint mode at the moment, Rowan.
That's fine.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay, so I'm primarily just I put some pictures up here because I think pictures say a lot more about what I do than I could tell you. So John just alluded to with the aspects of ESG within exploration. I'm just going to briefly talk about my experience of working as an exploration geologist in West Africa and Liberia, and how we've, as a small company, tried to implement these principles in a positive manner. I will start with, I've done a bit of a collage of photos. I will start here in this central photo. What we have here is one of our local community meetings with our ESG advisor, and you see Clarence here is obviously our government coordinator. He's experienced in consulting on environmental, social issues in Liberia with regards to the exploration industry. So as we've been in Liberia recently, what our main target is obviously exploration for precious and base metals that support the raw materials industry. Primarily, we're looking for gold, but obviously working in West Africa, there are other elements of interest as well. So our approach really as a junior exploration company is to try and do exploration differently to what has historically been undertaken, whereby we've embraced ESG principles and standards and aimed at implementing them from the very beginning of the exploration process. So even before we went into Liberia, we undertook desk studies, gathering demographic, geographic information to understand where these communities are in the licenses that we're working in. And we've obviously got ESG advisors, and we're liaising with government and other consultants from Liberia who obviously support our work there, in the sense that they can give us some understanding as to the cultural, geographical, historical sensitivities of working in such countries. So our principal methodology of working is going out and consulting initially with the communities. We primarily do this by sending out ESG advisors supported by local guides, consultants, Liberian consultants, to understand what the local community's perception is of the mining and exploration industry, and how we can work with them to limit our impact, both socially and environmentally, in the communities that we are working in. In these communities, of course, they're generally very rural, obviously in jungles and in the middle of nowhere quite often. So they have very little interaction with mining exploration companies, as Liberia is relatively underexplored. But obviously, as you can see on the left of my screen, we have one of the artisanal mines that we've come across. So the issue with working in these regions is they have very little understanding of what exploration actually is, purely because the perception and what they've seen of mining and exploration is based around these images of artisanal mining, which obviously is very widespread in West Africa. So from our perspective, we have to explain to the local communities what our objectives are and how we are going to work. But before we even go in and explain our objectives, we go in and we listen to the communities before we even kind of try to put our plans forward, because of course we have a plan of work and how we want to work and what we want to achieve. But obviously we're not going to pursue this line of operations without the social license to operate. So when we enter these communities, we ask what their concerns are, what their perceptions are of the industry, what they would like from us, how they would like to interact with us, what we can help them with, and our transparency. And more often than not, we have pretty much all the time we have positive feedback from the local communities. They're generally very appreciative of people coming in and asking their opinion and engaging and communicating and being transparent. Of course, sometimes this doesn't happen and there are issues, but the approach that we've taken is that we will go in with an idea of complete transparency and engagement with the local communities, but also not just by listening to their concerns, we act on them. For example, some of the villages that we have worked in, most villages in Liberia, they have cultural, religious, historical sites around the villages, cemeteries. There are areas that are sacred that certain people from outside can't enter. So to be sensitive to this, what we generally do is in every village and town that we work in, we take guides from each community who lead us around when we're doing any kind of exploration. So we're always interacting with the local communities to make sure that we don't disturb anything or in kind of impose ourselves unnecessarily. And also by taking the local communities, it gives us a high level of transparency working with these communities, because they can see what we're doing. And obviously their perception of mining is what you see on the left here, is the artisanal mining. But what we try to show the communities we're working in is that what we're doing is not necessarily what their perception is. We are just taking soil samples, mapping, walking around the bush, investigating outcrop. And what we try to do by taking local guides out with us is that they understand directly what we are doing and how we are working. They can see how we're working. And that gives full transparency as to what we're doing. And that gives a bit of peace of mind. And then obviously then it's a feedback loop between ourselves and the communities. If they have apprehensions or they're worried about us going into certain areas, we can take people from the communities and engage with them and show them how we work to improve confidence between ourselves and the communities. But furthermore, with regards to ESG, how we are setting our practices as well, from an ESG perspective as an exploration company, is obviously working with the communities. But also we are of the belief that even though we're just carrying out exploration, we're not doing anything extractive, we're not really having a very big environmental impact on the area. It's still our responsibility to look after the communities that we're in. And generally with our ESG scoping, with our ESG advisors, they go to the communities and speak to the communities. There are big meetings and we set out questionnaires of what their concerns are with the communities and how we can also help the communities and what we can do to help with their way of life. How can we positively impact these communities with the short time that we're actually there? And what we've done in certain cases is that we've tried to help local communities as almost a gesture of goodwill, and how to work with these communities and leave a positive benefit from our work. For example, we've rebuilt a bridge to one of our villages that we're working in, purely because our ESG scoping study questionnaire showed that one of the main concerns for the community was not our work, but the issue that they had was that they had no road access to their village, purely because the bridge had collapsed. So in that sense, and obviously there's a big community there, so they had a big problem with child mortality and maternity care for pregnant women, because the only way they could get to a doctor was taking a motorbike while in labour to the main cities. So we approached that and we thought, well, we can leave a positive impact here by purely fixing their bridge, which is, you know, something that we've tried to do to integrate with the community and help them. And furthermore, obviously working in these communities, it's always beneficial, and obviously certainly the right way to operate is engaging with local authorities. So if you can see down in the bottom here, this bottom photo, the gentleman on my right hand side is Sam Cooper, and he is the mining agent. So he is a government appointed authority for the area we're working in. And sat to my far left is the town chief. So obviously being an exploration geologist, you know, we've had our ESG scoping study done, and then that's all been finalized, gone in, but I always aim to maintain a good relationship with the authorities and the local communities and engaging with them constantly. So whatever work we do, we feed back, we keep transparent, we obviously engage the relevant community authorities and the government authorities. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. Seconds. Right. And I'm going to keep talking now. So what we're trying to do by implementing good ESG practices is to keep a good, open, transparent feedback loop between the local communities and what we're doing and the local authorities. So all the demographic work we do through our ESG and what I encounter, because obviously in some senses and instances you go to these areas to work and there are villages that are not mapped. There are communities where there's no demographic data. So we try to collate that data as well and feed it back to local authorities and have a consistent feedback loop to ensure that there's full transparency between our operations and the communities. And generally, I've always had positive interactions with communities. I've always had a good welcome. I've worked with, one of my guides was actually the paramount chief of one of the villages. So I've worked with them consistently throughout. And I think this is the direction we've tried to take with our exploration, has set a precedent now within the industry that this can be done, and it's not hard, it's not costly in the slightest. It's just a determination to do things differently now. And as we're going into a more sustainable society and economy, the need to find more raw materials is going to increase, and we're going to have to start engaging and exploring for new materials, rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt in some of these regions. But the primary focus should be here on is that we need to engage and make our industry sustainable. And that's what our approach has been from the beginning. Our desire to not just find deposits, but to work with communities and do it in a sustainable manner. And I think I'll leave it there. I've gone on now for a while. I'll happily answer questions.
That was absolutely brilliant, Rowan, and thank you very much for bringing us some of your work pictures with you. So round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for the fantastic Rowan Thorne. That was brilliant. Now, Rowan, we've got time for a quick couple of questions. The first one here comes in from Rachel, and she asks, how do you play out good ESG practice within your artisanal mining community at that exploration level, keeping in mind that a development phase could come?
Right, that's a good question, and that is something we've had to actually deal with, because you come across these artisanal mines. They're not maps. You can just walk through a jungle and just find a massive cutting in the forest. But what we generally do, again, is transparency. We go to these operations, and generally we met, people are like, oh, okay, so why is someone, especially an outsider, coming in? What's going on? And what we have to do is actually explain to them that we're not, firstly, they think we're there to take over the mine. Okay, that's generally their perception. So what we have to do is make it clear that that's not our objective. It's our objective. We're just doing exploration. Our objective is not to impose on what they're doing, because obviously these mines are subsistence mining. They are the lifeline of these people. But also what one has to make clear is that if there was any interaction between the company further down the line in the future and these artisanal miners, is to make clear very much so that the objective is not to take over the mine and move all the miners on. If there was to be an interaction, we would have to engage with the local community and the people employed on the mine. I think that's very far away at the moment, but what we would have to say is that any operation further down the line would be of the benefit of the people working in the mine and the local communities. It's not, our position is not to take over, it's to work with and develop with the mine and any communities surrounding these areas.
Thank you for that, Rowan. And actually, we've had a very similar questioning come in through chat as well, which I'm sure you can address after we finish.
Yeah.
So final question to you, and that's around kind of almost this evolving skill set that perhaps that geoscientists need. So, you know, you're a geologist, but would you also consider yourself to be moving into being an ESG specialist, or do you think that that is just part of a geologist's skill set that they need to have?
I believe it's a skill set that a geologist needs to have. Now, the world is different. The industry is much different to what it was. Our awareness of working in this industry in a much more sustainable manner, applying ESG principles, should be part of a geologist's repertoire to say now, because no matter where, I've worked in different countries and I've always come across issues. I've seen it in Spain, Finland, everywhere. But a geologist needs to be prepared for such issues to come up. You can't just, as a geologist, you can't go into these communities and be confronted with issues and concerns in turn and go, well, I don't know, it's not my job, it's not my expertise, I'm just going to have to leave it. That's even more damaging than not answering a question and engaging in the first place. So I think it should be part of a geologist's tool set now to be able to engage, even at a basic level, even to communicate and be clear of what you're doing. Yes, certainly. And obviously, geologists may, like myself, drift towards that ESG side of things by naturally. Now, while the industry is now evolving, it might be natural that expert geologists are actually evolving with it. The role of geologist is probably changing as the demands of the industry are, yes.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Rowan.
Thank you.
I think that's a case as well of, you know, knowing what you don't know, so you can then pull in specialists for certain areas where you need it, is perhaps that critical thing, which I guess hopefully anyway supports what John was saying just prior to you. So brilliant. Ladies and gents, please put your hands together for the fantastic Rowan Thorne. That was brilliant. And actually, just on that final note there, I've just posted into chat a link to a little YouTube video, which we've just been given permission to use by Ian Stewart, who spoke to us yesterday. And this is an informal collaboration between UNESCO and also BHP, so a very large mining company, looking at how geoscience, for example, is evolving. And so you see that science of geology, of geophysics, geochemistry, etc., changing in terms of what we need. So if you haven't watched enough YouTube videos over the course of the last few days, there's another one for you as well. And that supports very much, I think, what Rowan has just said. So ladies and gents, into our last formal speaker of this morning's session, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Ruth Apps, who's going to actually kind of change gear a little bit and now say, okay, so we understand about how we need to, or have already been improving the ways in which we go and explore for these rocks. How about actually getting some more information about what is going on or what is in existence below the Earth's surface? So Ruth, ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together for the wonderful Ruth, and over to yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. Just to check, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yep, we can. It's beautiful.
Wonderful. So good morning, everybody. My name is Ruth. I am the Business Development Manager for a company called Gravitricity, based in Edinburgh, in Scotland. We are developing a new form of mechanical energy storage. So you've heard a lot today about lithium-ion batteries, and they are obviously a chemical form of energy storage. We're going to talk about the other side, the reutilizing what natural assets we have to provide other forms of energy storage. So there's us, and so mechanical forms of energy storage. You probably know the most common one is our sister technology, which is pumped hydro. So pumped hydro works by moving water up a mountain, storing it and releasing it when necessary to produce electricity. Our system does that, but with weights up and down the shaft. So we use, currently, where our first project is in, we're using ex-coal mining shafts and putting weights up and down them to store energy. And then when you need electricity, we'll lower those weights and release electricity back onto the grid. What makes us unique is that we're using those winches are used as generators. That's where our unique IP sits. There's not, and also in the material used to make the weight. Obviously, you want to be a low carbon solution, and we don't want to contribute any more carbon footprint. So why do we need more energy storage? The world is going net zero to make carbon-free electricity systems and energy systems. So to do that, you're going to need more energy storage. Renewables, the wind doesn't blow when you want it to, the sun doesn't shine when you want it to. So you need to store that energy produced when it does, so you can use it when it doesn't. So Gravitricity has two systems, a single weight and a multi-weight, but I'll come on to why that's important later. So as I was saying, we're going to renewables on our energy systems. We're going to need energy storage, but why exactly? So I talked briefly about intermittency, but you're also going to need to have grid upgrades. Most existing electricity networks are built for thermal generation, i.e. coal power plants or gas power plants. They are going to need energy storage at certain points on those networks to reinforce them, to keep the electricity flowing. There's also the need for ancillary services, which used to be done by thermal power plants, but now are going to have to be done by different forms of energy storage. So what makes Gravitricity a very unique form of mechanical energy storage is that we can do a sub 1 second response, which in electricity network terms means that you can keep your frequency at that steady number, whatever frequency number you have. It's 50 hertz in the UK, constantly. You don't want to go beyond that, above or below that, or else the electricity network will fall over. You do not want that. And then also you've got arbitrage, i.e. that ability to move when you're using your energy, store it to use it when you need it. But this all means that energy storage is going to be a really big thing in the future to enable renewables, to enable that green energy revolution that keeps getting talked about and prevent grid upgrades. This is Bloomberg New Energy Finance's data. I'm not going to go too much detail, but you can see it's going to be a massive market. The whole energy storage market they see as being worth about 620 billion. Most of it will be lithium ion because you've got EVs, and often what's going to happen is going to be at the distribution level. That will be that's your house level, and then the transmission level, that's basically the bigger, that's the motorways of electricity network. That's where your pylons exist, that sort of size. That will be mechanical energy storage forms like pumped hydro or forms like Gravitricity that can provide long duration and long asset life. They're there consistently over years. And then these are the grid infrastructure upgrades you'll see. That's also is going to need to happen to facilitate the transition to renewable energy. There's a lot of money going into electricity, which has probably never happened before they were built. So what makes Gravitricity unique? I've mentioned a few bits about it. So a mechanical form of energy storage, we have been designed our system to have an extremely long asset life. We've designed it to be a transmission network level asset. So it's designed for at least 25 years operation. We can go at all scales, size networks, but it's designed to have that long asset life. That means lithium ion has about 7 years at the moment. We expect it to improve, but at the moment we are 25 plus years, and we'll probably go up to 40 years with only a bit of maintenance, no need for replace anything. We also, what makes us very unique is that we don't have a discharge problem. So your phone over the course of its life, it doesn't charge properly and it runs out its battery quickly. Doesn't happen with a weight down the shaft. It's just going up and down, and it's the same depth it can drop lower to and the same height it can raise to consistently over its life, which makes it have a great levelized cost of storage. That means that compared to lithium ion, because lithium ion has such a short asset life and ours has such a long asset life, we're about $40 per megawatt hour cheaper than lithium ion over the course of our lifetime, which means it's ideal if you have a remote community and you just need to plump in a form of energy storage and put some solar or wind on and not have to think about it. Another really important thing is, this is why lithium ion won't capture the whole energy storage market right now, is that with mechanical forms of energy storage, there's no risk of explosion. So lithium ion batteries can't go into certain places like chemical plants. A lot of companies that approach us are chemical plants. They can't put lithium ion batteries in their chemical plants or on their chemical plant sites. And so they're sort of looking for different solutions they can add in. That means that they can also have renewables on their industrial facility and have a form of energy storage, to mean that they always have that 100% green energy option to operate 24 hours a day. So Gravitricity, we've just built that demonstrator on the left. I'm going to show you a lovely picture. It's on the BBC website if you want to see a video of it moving up and down. We say we're a scale up. We're not a startup. We're not at commercialization, but we're moving through the pipeline to get commercialization. We've just that scale model there is 20 meters high. It basically is to test our system engineering dynamics. It's to prove our commercial characteristics. It's basically to enable, basically to give confidence in our company. And then, so now we're developing and started breaking on our full scale prototype, which is a full scale system, which will be 4 to 8 megawatts in size. Then that gives the confidence, and we know what engineering challenges we face because of the testing we're doing right now that's being undertaken. If you're in Edinburgh, you can go and see it. It's in the Port of Leith, and you can see it across the basin if you want to see it. And then when we've got the full scale system, our idea is to go into 2 markets, new purpose sunk shafts, because they don't have to be as deep. And then it means we're geologically, not geographically constrained. And then existing mineshaft projects. There's a lot of, I'm going to come on to this, a lot of activity in Europe around the just transition, and the coal mining operations currently in existence. A lot of them are going to be asked to close or will become financially unfeasible by 2030 and will have to close. And so they're already looking and seeking solutions of what they can do with those assets at their end of their life, which is why I've just given you a very quick run through. So our concept demonstrator, as I said, it's an above ground system, because obviously when electricity network operators are very risk averse, they do not want anything novel on their network they can't see and check. So they was like, to be connected, it had to be above ground, and so we can see the weights moving up and down as well. It's actually a dual system. So initially it's a single weight system, then we're going to split the weight into 2 and it becomes a multi-weight, which means you can do 2 different services at the same time, which is really beneficial if you're looking to maximize your revenue. So this is, I think, the real crux of it. There's 2 models of Gravitricity. You can take the system and put it into an existing mining operation, or you can take it and then at the end of the life of a mining operation, you have the option of doing something else with that site. So this is the Laze mine in Czechia. This is one of the big sites we're looking at. They have about currently 6 deep coal mines just coming out of operation or just recently closed. They go into the hands of the local authority, and the local authority is looking for things to do. Now in Europe, they often, if they're not UK capped, so often some get capped, some get turned. So in Sweden, we've seen examples of them being used for nuclear waste facilities, as research labs. Germany's turned some of theirs into obviously coal mining museums or theme parks. Or I think there's like a techno rave dance center in Germany you can go, that's a former open pit. But there's lots of different uses they can do with them. But what they're looking for is to, obviously you have to obviously pay the costs of obviously making sure it's safe. You've still got to meet those. So you're obviously looking to try and maximize revenue on that site, not just have it go out of use. So when we build this project, there's obviously lots of different stakeholders we have to engage with very early on to make this project happen. And they are the local regional authority who own the sites. Then there's all the utility operators, so your electricity network operators or your transmission system operator, probably in Europe, the TSO. Then you have all of you need your legal and policy advisors, your local community, which Fazali coal mining regions, I've already understanding that they are their community is against the flow of the green transition, and so they've already sort of started engaging with other methods of what can we do with this site, what is beneficial for us, where's our next source of income coming from. So they're very engaged and proactive. But then there's other parties. So it's bringing all the stakeholders together to make this project happen. Now, we call it our Project A, our first of a kind project. What makes it so interesting is that it's because what makes it so interesting is so many different stakeholders involved, and it's just getting them all brought on board into this idea of moving to a renewable energy system. So this is all the sort of people we work with. Basically, if you want to come on board, do drop us a line. We're very friendly, and we're always looking for project partners in all consultants, drilling contractors, all manners of things to help develop the gravitricity system. And I think that's a very quick run through, but basically how you get a former asset into 100% renewable asset.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Ruth. Ladies and gents, please put your hands together for the wonderful Ruth Apps. That was absolutely brilliant. And I am, by the way, the messaging behind the scenes on different forums has gone mental in terms of, oh, could you do this? Could you do that? Etc. So I know that I've been receiving all kinds of private messages, but please get them into the Q&A and the chat, and then I can ask some of them to Ruth. So Ruth, in terms of this, so one of the main problems, I guess, at the moment in terms of batteries and also other forms of renewable power generation is the fact that we need quite an exciting mix of different minerals and metals to be able to get something like photovoltaics, wind turbines, etc. to work. Do you need anything special for this in terms of the metals that you need to get it to work?
No, I mean, we do obviously have a computer control system at the back end to make the winches move as generators when they need to, because they have to have that sub-second response to get the extra revenue that's really important for developers. But apart from that computer system, it's a standard computer, that's standard like my Mac sitting here, no. We use our weight. People often think our weight is concrete. It is not concrete. It is a high density iron material. So some people here will know exactly what that is, but then it's nothing, there's no rare earth elements in our system. It's all just steel and iron, and very boring, I'm afraid.
None of it's boring, Ruth, none of it's boring, but some of it's perhaps easier to acquire, shall we say. With this, do you need, for example, if you are repurposing, as it were, old mine shafts, do you need them to be 100% dry, or does moisture impact on what you're looking at?
No, they can be wet, they can be full of water. We just have to adjust the weight we're using. It doesn't move very fast. I think people think we're dropping something. We're not, we're lowering it. It's just how quickly, and that's the really important caveat. So as long as we can adjust the weight to accommodate for the water and infill in that shaft, then that's fine. What makes it trickier is that we need to know the condition of that lining to make sure there's nothing that's fallen in or got in the way to get that weight down to the bottom. So then we'd have to do a lot more feasibility work at the front to investigate that.
Yeah, because I guess, I mean, one of the biggest outlays, I guess, during an operational mine is actually maintaining that shaft and that infrastructure. Yeah. So I guess, is that something you're having to look at, where perhaps the mine has only been looking at the life of that mine and keeping the shaft open to that point in time, is actually saying, well, hang on a second, don't let it fall apart because we want to come in on the action here.
Yeah, I mean, and that's so what's happened in Eastern Europe is where we're looking at for our initial project is that it come into the hands of the local authorities, and they have no real they understand there's costs associated with it, but then suddenly go, oh, that's a lot of cost associated with it, and then they're looking for, like, how can they maximize that revenue? Because often it's not just our system just sits on top of the shaft, then you have the whole other site to do something with it. So you're not only just getting, and if you're thinking, oh, energy storage doesn't have a lot of how do you make your money? Well, at the moment, a lot of electricity markets don't have ancillary services, as they don't pay for them, but they will have to when they put more renewables on them, because you need to make sure the electrons keep flowing. But if you look at the Hornsdale battery reserve, that's a Tesla battery, one built in Southern Australia. That paid for itself within 2 years because they had one frequency event on their network, and that. So there is money there to be made in energy storage, whether you have batteries or not. So.
Awesome, thanks, Ruth. And at the moment, this is a question from Norm. Obviously, you're kind of focusing in on Europe, okay? So including Edinburgh within Europe in that at the moment. Are you also exploring possibilities in the US and beyond?
Yeah, we have UK government energy catalyst funding. We're currently doing feasibility work in South Africa, so that's really important for us. And also in the US, we are talking to various mining operators out there who are very keen on the idea as well, especially in places where they've maybe had an electricity event recently this year that's panicked them. Yes, there are other, and we don't have to have a shaft necessarily. We can do it on a pit wall with the right incline. So
cool, excellent. Yes, you don't need to have it to be vertical. It can be a decline or an incline that's going on there as well. And does it have to, what's the optimum depth or kind of, I guess, vertical distance that you're looking at? I guess it could be height above the ground as well as going into the ground, could it?
Well, so we need a drop. So it's actually obviously it's not just the drop, it's also the diameter. So when we ideally say, if we have an existing shaft, we ideally ask for it to be at least a minimum of 3 meters in diameter and a 300 meters drop. So we have access to get it up and down 300 meters. For a purpose sunk shaft, because we can put a multi-weight system in there, and that means there's weights going, we don't have to go as deep. We only need 150 meters, and that starts you off at 1 megawatt. And that's quite useful for certain applications.
Cool. And do you do mini versions? So if you are in an off-grid cabin in Scotland, are there mini versions that will be available on the market sometime soon?
We're not going to do mini versions, I'm afraid. But that demonstrator does need a home. So when it finished testing, if you can get a truck, you can take it.
Excellent. I think, ladies and gentlemen, we've just done a deal, and the Satala and Responsible Raw Materials Scottish office just has its battery. Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Ruth. Moving swiftly on from that, I know that there are lots of people on this call busy going, oh, I've got loads of ideas for you. Ruth, if you want to have those ideas, please put your email address into the chat. If you don't want to be bombarded by those ideas from mad geologists, etc., then don't put your email address in, and instead, ladies and gents, bombard Rose and myself with those ideas, and we'll then pass them on to Ruth anyway. So brilliant. Thank you so much, Ruth. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Ruth Apps and the wonderful world of weights. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thank you, Ruth. So to round off this morning's session, during which I'm sure you will all agree with me, we have heard from some absolutely brilliant speakers, a really diverse array of ideas, insights, etc. And just to help us kickstart the panel session, because you'll note that at the end of all of our sessions, we invite our speakers to turn their cameras back on again and engage with one another in a bit of chat. But also, we've typically got an invited speaker as well to slip into the mix. So I'm really glad to welcome the wonderful Marit. Now, Marit, I don't know if you want to come off mute and quickly introduce yourself, and then perhaps, I know you've been sitting there thinking about lots of different ideas and things that have maybe sparked some ideas in your head. But Marit, if you want to introduce yourself first and then share some of the aha moments that you've had this morning.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Yeah, great to be here. Great talks. My name is Marit van Salingen. I'm a geologist background, have a geologist background too. Had a taste of the mining industry doing my PhD with BHP Billiton, was sponsored by BHP Billiton. But afterwards, didn't go into the industry, didn't really stay in academia, but really moved into education. And that's where I really realized that there is a lot of work to do based on my own experience in my PhD, but also based on my experience teaching a lot of students which are not per se having a science background. I really started thinking, what are the skills that make a geologist great and unique? But I also realized, what are the skills that are missing? And looking at the talks, I definitely lack some important skills, which I think would have been great to have. And I loved the talks. I loved the experience Rowan shared, saying, yeah, the geologist repertoire is changing, industry is evolving, so the geologist role is also evolving. And I loved John Russell saying as well, yes, I think students coming out of their degree should have a good understanding of the importance of ESG, and I think it is so true. So what I try to do here is to learn a lot and mine all your information, your experience, because I think there is a real potential to create some great education material. And I don't want to be naive and think I'm going to rechange the entire academic system in universities, because I know how much it changed to time it takes to change a whole curriculum and a whole course. But I'm really looking to create 2-3 hour activities where students really can get an experience of what it is out there, really seeing how important it is to have ESG. And I'm mainly thinking now about geology students, but I think it can be a really wide scale. And I think a great example I use a lot in my teaching is role play. Why don't we create a whole scenario where there are different stakeholders and students need to play different stakeholders? Because I think then we come back to what Ludovine said and was also quoted again this morning by Ruth Ellington, saying stakeholders realizing they never belong to a single group is so important. And I think when you already start doing that already at university scale is super crucial. And then, of course, when you have role play activities, we can also include what Ruth Ellington was talking about today and Ian Stewart was talking about yesterday, really about developing skills such as effective dialogue, deep listening. And I love that Ruth said, these skills don't make me a worse geologist. Actually, they make my technical and geology skills more effective. So what I want to do, if you have great scenarios, if you think, oh, I had this scenario in the field, this would make a great case study, please contact me, because I would love to work with you and see if we can actually make really cool different modules that we can just slot into existing curriculum, or student groups can work on together if universities don't want to use. There's so many students chapters over the world. But also if you have other ideas than role play, let me know. I would love to hear what you think. Oh, this is really a good experience-based activity that students can do and would help to maybe let them go into industry a bit more effectively. So yeah, thank you for all your wisdom, and it's been very great to be here. Thank you, Sarah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Marit. And I'm really glad that this has been useful for you this morning. Now, Ruth Ellington, your name has been mentioned in vain quite a lot just now by Marit, because I know that you also very much enjoy using that role play approach, etc. Do you have any suggestions or ideas for Marit on what she might be able to do here? And then perhaps I'll pass across to Murray, because I suspect he might have some ideas as well.
Yeah, I think, particularly inspired by listening to Rowan, and I loved seeing the pictures and hearing the story behind the pictures. My favourite picture that Rowan showed was him sitting with the two guys drinking mugs of presumably tea. I don't know what was in the mugs. It might have been beer for all I know, but clearly having made, in all the pictures, but in that one especially, having made this essential human connection. Having made that connection, it brings geologists a whole new dimension to their working life, and B, it enables us to start communicating, to start exchanging information, and working collaboratively on how we're going to go forward. So I would think that a case study that was rooted in, and also in what John Russell was telling us, was rooted in the very earliest parts of that, being in a new community, approaching a new community. How do you go about it? And testing out how we have those conversations, testing out what works and what doesn't work. There's a brilliant exercise you can do about listening, where you get into pairs, and the first instruction is that somebody's the speaker and somebody's the listener. The speaker is instructed to speak for 1 minute on some subject or other that's important to them, but not sort of massively traumatic, and the listener is instructed to not really pay attention, just to be there and look around. And almost nobody that I've experience doing this, myself included, can go on for a whole minute without any sort of interaction, so speaking into the void. And then you do it again, and this time the listener is instructed to look at the speaker and maybe to nod a bit, but to say nothing. And then the third time, the listener, when the speaker has come to a natural pause, the listener says, "So what I heard you say was X, Y, Z." And then a conversation starts, even if the listener has really not achieved the message. So little exercises like that. And I'm sure, Marit, you're going to be very excited to hear what Maria Arpa has to say, because she's my teacher and inspiration in all of this kind of stuff. So, but yeah, I think developing an overall scenario and having little role plays and discussions would be absolutely fantastic. And just on this call, we've got so much experience between us of real situations.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ruth. So what I heard you say there was, see, I'm learning, but I now actually need to try and summarize what I actually heard you say, was that absolutely, yes, Marit, this sounds like a really good idea. There are a multitude of different tools and techniques that are out there, including ones about how to really listen to somebody, like truly listen, and that two-way exchange of information as well. But Murray, I promised I was going to come to you next. Murray, how about some ideas from your end? And then I know, Andy, you've actually posted a really useful link into the chat, so I'll come to you next.
So thank you. And Ruth, I'm going to steal some of your ideas and use them in future. One of the things I've done in my career with different groups, I did it when I was with Chevron with our geologists, and I certainly did it USGS with our scientists there when I was associate director, and I'm doing it now with ICRAG, is especially at USGS and as an academic, I have all my students and all the researchers I work with require them to be able to tell me in 30 seconds why the taxpayers are giving them money to do what they're doing. So, someone's funding you with a lot of money to do something. So in 30 seconds, I call it the elevator speech. So who cares, right? And I developed this when I was in Washington, I guess, because literally, Ruth, you're saying you're talking to somebody, and often with a politician, you have 30 seconds, and often the face is blank, right? And so, this is your chance, and if you blow it, you blow it. So it's a really important skill. Taking it further today, the important thing would be, so my original training was an anthropologist before geology, and doing this then in different cultures becomes really important. And what Rowan showed is, you have to learn where you are and what's happening and be able to figure out how to talk, the language, and what to talk about. So it becomes infinitely more complex once we, move beyond our normal culture.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Murray. And who knew you started off in anthropology? That is truly brilliant. That's great. Andy, I'll come to you just in a second, but also to point out that into the chat, our Samsung attendee. So Samsung, my sincere apologies. If your name is Samsung, that's brilliant. If that's the device that you're on, that is also fantastic. But that computer game built around climate change, if you can find the link, that would be really exciting, because again, one of the purposes of this conference is to try and share as many of these ideas and links as possible, so that we can all make use of them as and when is appropriate. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Samsung. You have found it. So Andy, maybe let's come to yourself and just ask for any insights from your end, and then perhaps we can go to John.
Sure. Well, I gave the link to the game, and basically we developed, or Prima Mohideen, an educationist, developed the game really more for school-age students, but we've used it at universities, we've used it in community, and basically it's the idea of understanding where the minerals in a phone come from, and the phone being such a good idea because everyone has one, and particularly for school-age children, that's pretty much their central part of their life. So getting them to think about, where it comes from and what happens to it. It is very much an open style role play where you're just trying to ask through questions as well as go around the board. So I definitely recommend people to look at it. The other thing, and in some ways it's almost a reply back to that question from Murray, we were kind of having a little side chat as well. I was saying that one of the projects I'm working on through other people is basically working with indigenous communities who have the right to free, prior, informed consent, but very often don't. Consent normally allows them to have their own decision-making process. A lot of the time the decision-making process isn't clear. So we've actually been working with communities to kind of put up their capacity before they meet mining companies, so they have clarity in how they deal with them. I think that's been a really interesting learning experience. And oddly enough, approaching it from that side and saying, if you're a community, how do you kind of think through your process? I think that would be an interesting way of looking at it as well.
Yeah, and I guess as well, it almost forces you to have more empathy, because you're actually having to put yourself in the shoes and socks of those different stakeholders, those different people who are within that ecosystem. Would that be correct, Andy?
Yeah, absolutely. And clearly you can think through to an extent, but trying to actually, very much live through an experience of decision making, which is very often rooted in the culture, as all anthropologists should know. So trying to understand that and work from that viewpoint. And it also down to communication as well, again, how people communicate, which again is so culturally based. And I think, it really helps consider all of those issues as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andy. And thank you as well, Lorraine, who is the Samsung, posting all of those fantastic links in chat. That is truly fantastic. John, how about yourself? What about some insights from your end? And of course, building on that brilliant decision tree that you showed us and that came out of the InFact work. And then perhaps we can go to Victor.
Yeah, I think I'd like to go back onto the educational side of things, actually, because I as Rowan demonstrated, and so many of us have mentioned, these are skills that geologists need to have, and I think that it would be quite an easy thing to integrate into a course as a module, maybe for final year students, for example. And I've been really inspired by a lot of people that I've worked with in this area, and they're all really passionate about wanting this to happen and wanting to get it right. And I think there's no shortage of people that are willing to step in and provide this sort of additional educational content. And in the last couple of years during this pandemic as well, we've even developed some really good platforms to be able to deliver this sort of thing remotely, including online role-playing scenarios, actually, which I'll write to you about, Merit. But yeah, I do think it's key. I think there is really an appetite for it in universities. They're struggling as well with funding cuts. With the importance of earth science education in universities is being diminished at the moment. There's old standing courses that are being shut down. It's really sad to see. But at the same time, there's my cat. There's some other universities which are really getting on board with this. St Andrews, for example, they've just started a new master's on responsible resource management, which is brilliant, and that needs to happen. It needs to happen quickly.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you, John. And I think that's something where quite a lot of us sitting around this panel, I know we all lecture at different universities and bring that experience into those universities, be it, so Rose is at the University of Leicester, I lecture at Imperial College, etc. as well. And I think all of us try and bring in that responsibility aspect into the natural resources world. But there are, of course, lots of other forums as well, so like Geology for Global Development as well as another avenue that can really help with this, and I know that I'm missing out on loads of them. Victor, let's come to yourself, because I know you've also got lots of ideas on this front, and then perhaps let's go to Ruth Apps, coming at this from, again, slightly different angle, because I'm acutely aware there are quite a lot of geologists sitting around the table, and you don't have to be a geologist in this world, just to make that really clear. But to speak to a geologist, Victor.
Thank you, Sarah. In fact, I want to share something that I learned when I was serving at European Federation of Geologists, and it links to what Murray just said with communication to policymakers or to politicians, and also what the approach Ruth normally uses of listening. And I remember that we were trying to get the attention of politicians, and then we realized that having this, they have a very short span of attention. So if you don't have these 30 seconds or 1 minute, and then they go blank and they just go away. But even if they provide you some attention, you also have the risk of them thinking that they don't really need us because they have advisors and they can get a report tailor-made in, let's say, 2 days or 3 days. So what I learned is that instead of trying to push our ideas forward, we could simply ask them what are they planning to do, so what is their agenda, and how can we support them? And suddenly they start paying attention because they want to leverage, they want to get some results, they want to get some inputs, and then you start getting their attention and start and engaging in, let's say, a sort of dialogue. Of course, in that dialogue, you also need to be aware that the language that you need to use needs to be very simple, because many policymakers know it's just simple because they are not educated, let's say.
I'm going to call it,
because many of them, they are lawyers or economists, so they're the 7th grade, so it's like talking to a 13-year-old. Thanks.
Fantastic, Victor. You did go a little bit cyborg-esque, but I think this is just par for the course in terms of communication in this age of video conferencing. So thank you for that. And all of us were listening very, very hard and totally agree with what you were saying. So thanks, Victor. Ruth Apps, how about yourself? I mean, in terms of kind of getting that message across, but also, of course, listening to what somebody really needs. I mean, when you are building a company, you're constantly having to listen to what somebody truly needs and what's that pain point that you're solving. Would that be correct, or would you counteract that?
No, that is definitely correct. I'm going to caveat this. I did study geology at university. I never went and worked as a geologist. So it's all like I went into the electricity sector, which actually is got a lot of similarities. A part of what I worked on is in the UK, if you don't know how the UK get paid in network operators, is they have this structure called RIO, and one of those is called incentives, and one of those incentives is stakeholder management. They're really, Ofgem's really keen to make sure that those electricity networks are engaging in the right way with their key all their stakeholders. And so that's sort of carried through to what I do now, but it is so much about listening, and it's about understanding all the different groups and also bringing them in when you need to bring them in, because sometimes if a group stays too isolated and then you go and talk to them, they feel a bit hostile. They're like, why have I been left out of this conversation? Why are you now speaking to me? That's especially with local communities. But if you engage them early on, then I think it makes them feel welcomed and involved, and then they can sort of follow. And that, I think, is really important. But it's always lovely when I get a call on the office going, we talked about you in the pub last night, and is this going to happen? And is this going to explode? And then you just have to it's great. Just having those sort of conversations is just brilliant. Or the people who find shafts in their back garden. I now know it's Murray to blame for that. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't think Murray's drill holes were necessarily 3 meters wide and 300 meters deep, all of them, were they, Murray? But that then comes back to our mini version again, Ruth. But we'll be talking about that one later. Fantastic, thank you. And Rowan, how about yourself? I mean, like, absolutely phenomenal experience in Liberia, and thank you so much for sharing those stories. I'm sure you've got ideas as well in terms of sharing and teaching and learning with one another.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, as you said before, and as John alluded to, the investment and financing of STEM degrees in university now is being cut back a little, and I'm fully aware that in CSM they've had issues with their mining engineering degree that's been rolled back at the moment. So I think, in a sense, that it's almost up to the geologists that are currently in the industry that are willing to plug this gap, in a sense, whereby we should take our experience and what we've learned and what we do to the universities as well, rather than wait for them to reach out to us. We obviously need to engage throughout the whole spectrum. Social media obviously is a very powerful tool now, and what we've done today is also very useful. But we just need to be very public and engaging with what we do. We've got to be proactive. I think the industry years ago was kind of just a closed industry, the mining exploration industry. But now our awareness of the need to undertake sustainable mining and exploration is really there. I mean, I can't remember when I was at university talking about ESG and sustainable mining and all that. That didn't happen. And I'm not that old yet. I'm only so old, I'm not going to say, but that was only a couple of years ago, 8 years ago, when I left university, and I can't recall talking about ESG. So we need to take our experience in the industry now back to the universities, feed in. We can't expect academia to do everything. There are budgets. Lecturers and academics obviously have obligations in university, but we are becoming much more proactive now in our approach with science communication and what we do. And I think that's the way forward now, is to complement academia and obviously use social media to feed in to society, because it's obviously all well and good having geologists talking to each other, but obviously we need to talk to the people that are outside the industry, and that's one thing this conference is obviously aiming to do. And I'm sure there are ways, workshops, engaging with different bodies, environmental groups as well, to engage with them and offer our perspective, offer to approach them, because obviously historically we've always been seen as the ones trying to hide behind the industry and not be very open. So now maybe we need to reverse the roles and go into other organizations and be open about it. I think that's the way to go, certainly.
No, I think that's brilliant, Rowan. And actually the point I just took away from what you just said now is that we need to be able to complement one another.
Yeah, certainly.
Not to be to complement rather than conflict in a way. Yeah. So actually seeing, okay, how can we build things together? Obviously call one another out. There's a lot of C's here. Call one another out if we think that something is wrong or could be improved. But there's that, and that then goes into some more C's. So collaboration with one another, and then that word or that phrase that I think Ian set us off with yesterday, that co-creation. So building all of that together and moving forwards. So I think this is something here where, by the way, it was totally unintentional to have so many geologists in on the same call, just so that I can see just how badly we set up this morning session. Wave if you have a geology or geoscience somewhere in your background. Okay. Excellent. Don't worry, Andy and Ludovine, you are wonderful, wonderful people. If you want to know more about the rocks, we'd be very happy to have those discussions, be it in the pub or outside of the pub. Yes, don't worry, Ludovine, you are not totally alone. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of this, what we've got for this morning, I think we've heard a huge array of fantastic tools, tips, techniques as to how do we make ESG a reality within raw materials. Yes, we've gone into quite a lot of depth in terms of, say, exploration and the geological side of mining. But of course, there are many other aspects when it comes to not just the mining or the extraction of those materials out of the ground, but the processing of them, the selling of them. We heard from Hugo Brody at the beginning of today about the London Metal Exchange. So one of those primary forums where people buy and sell these commodities, and actually what the LME is bringing in terms of almost those ESG requirements just to be a part of that exchange. And that's something that has developed hugely over the last 12 months. This time a year ago, we heard from Hugo, and it's really interesting to see how much things have advanced over the last 12 months, despite COVID-19 and lockdown and everything. Really really good improvements have been made there, which is exciting to see. We then heard obviously from Victor, and Victor described the difference between hard power and soft power. And I think, Victor, you were mentioning it in the chat afterwards, just to try and clarify. At the end of the day, the soft power is the one that we're wanting to go for because that's more in line with ESG. Is that correct, Victor? Have I misinterpreted you?
Correct. The point is that if you are in a hard power framework, the ESGs won't be kept. So it will be all about soft power, hopefully.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, just to make sure we have clarification on that one there, Victor, which is brilliant. Then, of course, we had the fantastic Ruth Allington. And I think through Ruth's talk, we get a whole load of kind of tips as to how do you truly listen to somebody, and also that mediation process, because people are always going to have different perspectives. And I think that concept, Ruth, for me, of that somebody feeling powerless versus, okay, I maybe don't fully trust you, but at least I feel heard. And that shift in terms of someone's personal being, and that certainly really resonated with me. There's a whole lot of other stuff to obviously take away from your talk, but I think those are some of the key things that really resonated with me, which was great. Then into Andy's amazing synthesis of 70 pages into 10 minutes. So I really encourage everybody to go and take a look at the London Mining Network's report online with those fabulous graphics that you've got there, Andy, as well, that I think it's probably, again, me being a geologist, I just like pictures. So things like that kind of really resonating with me. And perhaps as well, from somebody who, I mean, I've spent most of my life working within the mining sector, actually saying, okay, well, no, what are the different perspectives around it as well? So thank you very, very much for bringing all of that into the room. That was brilliant. Then from Andy, we went across to Murray, and we got the world's most brilliant synthesis of a case study of a fantastic mine in Ireland, Lachine. So I encourage anybody who wants to see a case study of how do you find and then begin to go into those early stages, etc., of that mine, and go and take another look at Murray's talk, because especially the slides was full. They were absolutely packed with information that was really exciting there. So thank you very much for that, Murray. Then into John, who gave us the rundown on the decision-making tree for exploration within a mining project. And so thank you very much, John. And that synthesis, really, I guess, of one of the outputs that came from the European-funded InFact project, of course, as well, bringing in all of that expertise from SRK. So thank you, John, for that. Then we were transported to Liberia, and the wonderful world of Rowan. And we're not going to ask you what was in those mugs, Rowan, but it looked like you were certainly having a brilliant time, really interacting and getting to know and building trust with the local community as well. So thank you so much for all of those insights. And then, of course, into Ruth Apps, and the fact that lots of us now have scribbled diagrams generated, well, basically dredging up all of our school-based physics, etc., around gravity and what kind of weights we need, etc. So, Ruth, I think if you haven't already been bombarded with people saying, oh, I know of a mine shaft or something like that, then you will be in the near future. And then finally, of course, the wonderful Marit, who started us off on this great discussion within our closing panel here today. And Marit, hopefully we've given you some ideas that perhaps can be taken forwards. So thank you very, very much for that, and good luck with putting together those teaching products in the near future. So just before we let you all go, and I realize I'm just a minute over, but just to advertise this afternoon session, because this afternoon session starts off with the wonderful Lucy Crane and Ben Lepley, who are going to be talking about public perception of mines, etc. And so their talk begins to leverage wonderfully off the back of what we've just been speaking here. Okay, we're also going to be hearing from Nick Copeland, who's going to be talking about different tools and techniques for looking at social and security within the mining space. We're going to be hearing from a wealth of other individuals, and you can see all of their names up on the website, finishing off with, and I know that John is going to be featuring again this afternoon. So in terms of taking different stakeholder roles, a bit of role play. Catherine McCallum is going to lead us in a bit of role play around, okay, what does all this mean for an exploration geologist when we're thinking about the triple bottom line? How do we actually make this a reality? What sort of conversations should we be having? And then Rich Lloyd is going to help us with our panel later on this evening when we draw it all to a close. So ladies and gents, please put your hands together to say a massive thank you for our wonderful panel of experts and speakers for this morning. It has been truly wonderful. So thank you very much to all of you. We hope to see all of you later on today. If you can't make it, don't worry, it's all being streamed live to YouTube. If you've got any questions, ideas, please do feel free to send them through to hello@responsiblerawmaterials, and we'll address them as fast as possible. So thank